The Catholic Church has guarded many things, but some mysteries were hidden because they were considered too dangerous. Not heresy as we imagine it today, but books, testimonies, miracles, and entire ideas that vanished the moment they threatened the structure of faith and authority. Across 2,000 years, councils erased books from the record, inquisitors sealed files forever, and certain visions, relics, or scientific discoveries were quietly pushed out of sight. And the more you follow the trail, the clearer it becomes. These weren't random losses, they formed a pattern. Tonight you'll hear about the Gospels that almost reshaped Christianity, the saints whose voices were silenced, the sciences the Church feared would break its worldview, the trials that disappeared, and the vault inside the Vatican that almost no one is allowed to enter. But the most disturbing part is this: many of these mysteries weren't destroyed, they were simply moved out of reach. Let's begin with the earliest bans, and the first list the Church hoped the world would forget. You'll notice immediately that the Church's earliest attempts to shape doctrine weren't only about declaring what was true, they were about deciding what believers should never be allowed to encounter. Historians point out that in the late 5th century, a document attributed to Pope Gelasius I quietly introduced one of the first structured efforts to define which writings were acceptable and which were inherently dangerous. The modern reader sees it as a list, but researchers emphasize that it functioned more like a blueprint for control. This becomes the first major fact in this block. Gelasius didn't just ban heretical texts, he created a formal category for writings that were considered spiritually harmful, even if they circulated among Christians. You're seeing the beginning of a pattern. When an idea was perceived as destabilizing, the instinct was not to argue with it, but to bury it. Once that precedent existed, the second key fact emerges almost automatically. When Christian communities across North Africa tried to preserve sectarian manuals that described practices differing from Rome's developing orthodoxy, those documents began disappearing from official inventories. Scholars who study the early councils note that some of these manuals contained interpretations of fasting, communal authority, and penitence that varied enough to cause tension. Instead of allowing these differences to unfold in open debate, clerical authorities initiated what some historians call a quiet purge. Manuscripts that didn't align with the desired theological direction stopped being copied, and their presence in monastic libraries gradually faded. You're watching a mechanism take shape. If something threatened unity, its survival was treated as a risk, not a contribution. But if that were the whole story, it would be simple, yet the third fact complicates the picture and deepens the sense of something more deliberate happening. When the Council of Carthage addressed the issue of unapproved writings, the meeting produced a list that appears in fragments across later citations, but the full version never surfaced. Scholars debate whether the missing portions were lost by accident or intentionally suppressed. Some argue that the council may have condemned materials whose contents challenged evolving doctrines on purity, authority, or even the nature of the afterlife. Others propose that political motivations, not theological ones, shaped what should vanish. Regardless of the explanation, you're left with silence exactly where the documentation should be loudest. The surviving traces confirm the list existed. The absence of its core content forces you to ask what was so sensitive that the transmission of the record itself became undesirable. Even so, the most revealing detail comes in the fourth fact, which shifts the attention from banned doctrine to banned stories. Early Christian communities produced miracle accounts that varied widely in tone and intention. Some described healings, others detailed visions, revelations, or extraordinary encounters attributed to Jesus or his disciples. Yet historians note that by the time orthodoxy solidified, only the accounts aligning with approved theological structures were preserved. Others, especially those whose imagery conflicted with emerging dogma, were treated as unreliable and removed from circulation. Researchers examining patristic commentary highlight specific notes where church leaders explicitly encouraged the destruction of miracle narratives that might distort the faithful. When those instructions took effect, entire strands of early Christian imagination disappeared. You're witnessing not just censorship, but the narrowing of what the spiritual world was allowed to look like. As you move through these four threads together, a broader pattern becomes unavoidable. The earliest phase of ecclesiastical censorship wasn't random. It formed a controlled environment where narrative boundaries were policed, mystical traditions were pruned, and competing interpretations were smoothed away. The church was still forming its identity, and the cost of allowing too many divergent texts to survive was considered unacceptable. But you'll also notice something more subtle and far more telling. Each act of suppression created structural precedents that later authorities expanded dramatically. A banned list becomes a mechanism. A destroyed manuscript becomes a justification. A missing council document becomes a precedent for silence. And each of those precedents, once established, would empower future generations to decide what was safe for the faithful to know and what was better left in obscurity. The result is a landscape where the earliest centuries of Christianity contain holes that are not accidental but engineered. You're not just dealing with lost works, you're dealing with lost possibilities, alternative visions of Christianity that never reached maturity because they were cut off early. For modern historians, reconstructing this environment is like trying to rebuild a room when you only know the shape of the shadows. Every missing manuscript hints at a version of the faith that might have existed. Every vanished list suggests ideas that were considered destabilizing enough to eliminate entirely. And every destroyed miracle narrative raises the uncomfortable question of why certain forms of spiritual expression were deemed too dangerous to survive. What makes this first section especially powerful is the realization that the suppression wasn't chaotic. It was systematic in its intention to create coherence. The early church needed unity to define itself. Anything that jeopardized that unity was handled decisively. That fundamental logic, protecting the faithful by restricting what they could access, is the seed from which later, more intense acts of censorship would grow. The mechanisms refined during this early period paved the way for the Index of Forbidden Books, for inquisitorial investigations into doctrine, and for the deep vaults of archives where sensitive materials would eventually be stored beyond public view. When you see those later chapters, you'll remember that the foundation was laid here, in the centuries when the church was still finding its voice. But an even deeper implication emerges when you step back. This environment wasn't merely about protecting doctrine, it was about controlling narrative. If the story of salvation, authority, and divine intervention was to shape entire civilizations, then its contours had to remain consistent. Unapproved voices, whether mystical, analytical, visionary, or speculative, represented alternative futures that leadership could not allow. You're not observing the suppression of isolated texts, you're observing the shaping of an intellectual world, and that brings you naturally toward what comes next. If early forbidden writings helped establish the boundaries of acceptable belief, the next stage of suppression would target something even more volatile: the stories that claim to reveal Jesus, his disciples, and his teachings in ways that contradicted the authorized narrative. Those stories didn't just offer theological alternatives, they offered new portraits of Christ himself, and the church, determined to define who Christ was and what he meant, had to confront them directly. That tension is exactly what opens the door to the next chapter, the war over the Apocrypha, where entire Gospels vanished, where theological rivalries reshaped the canon, and where fragments survived only because buried jars, lost caves, and accidental discoveries brought them back into the light centuries later. Because once you understand how the first forbidden writings were handled, you'll be prepared to see just how far things escalated when the mysteries in question involved not merely doctrine, but the identity of Jesus himself. Historians observing the formation of early Christian literature often note that the canonical Gospels did not rise in a vacuum. They emerged amid a crowded landscape of competing testimonies, teachings, and spiritual interpretations. As Christianity expanded, the leadership faced an increasingly complex problem. Multiple communities preserved writings that depicted Jesus, his disciples, and divine revelation in ways that diverged from the growing consensus. The resulting struggle, later labeled by scholars as a war over the Apocrypha, was not a single event, but a series of decisions, suppressions, and disappearances that collectively shaped what future generations would call orthodoxy. One of the earliest elements in this conflict can be traced to a text known as the Gospel of the Egyptians, a work referenced by several early church fathers. Researchers emphasize that this gospel did not merely present alternative sayings of Jesus, it carried theological implications that unsettled developing teaching on sin, purity, and the nature of humanity. Its conversations hinted at an ascetic cosmology that diverged sharply from the trajectory Rome intended to follow. As ecclesiastical authority solidified, this unusual work began to vanish from circulation. Patristic writers comment on it only to condemn it, and no full copy survived. The disappearance illustrates the initial contours of this struggle. When a document contained elements capable of reshaping the moral or spiritual expectations of Christian life, it risked removal rather than debate. Additional pressure built around another text whose influence proved harder to contain, the Gospel of Thomas. Modern discoveries have resurrected it, but contemporaneous reactions indicate deep concern. Scholars explain that the tension centered not simply on the fact that Thomas differed from the canonical Gospels, but on how it differed. Its sayings emphasized interior revelation, direct knowledge, and spiritual awakening in ways that bypassed institutional mediation. The Church, in the process of structuring authority, regarded this emphasis as potentially destabilizing. The decision to reject the text, therefore, reflects not only doctrinal disagreement, but an early recognition that certain spiritual models could erode centralized guidance. The conflict surrounding Thomas offers insight into how the Church assessed risk. A document challenging the institutional role of authority, especially spiritual authority, was judged not only theologically incorrect, but too dangerous for unregulated circulation. With this tension already present, the situation escalated when movements such as the Marcionites produced their own refined versions of Christ's message. Marcion proposed a theological system that distinguished radically between the God of the Hebrew Scriptures and the Father revealed by Christ. To sustain this view, Marcion curated a gospel stripped of what he considered distortions. The Church's response to this effort, according to surviving records, was uncompromising. Bishops condemned the Marcionite gospel as a direct threat to the emerging canon and issued instructions to destroy circulating copies. Historians point out that this action stands as one of the clearest documented examples of deliberate eradication of a competing gospel tradition. It demonstrates the increasing resolve to control not just which teachings were acceptable, but which textual foundations were permitted to exist at all. As these tensions multiplied, a separate mystery emerged, one that still provokes scholarly debate. In 1945, the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library revealed a trove of early Christian writings previously unknown or long thought lost. Yet specialists examining the find have repeatedly noted the puzzling absence of certain works that are referenced in antiquity but missing from the surviving jars. Some hypothesize that additional codices were originally part of the collection but did not survive the journey through time. Others argue for the possibility of earlier removal, either by monastic custodians who sought to avoid charges of heresy, or by later hands who understood the politically risky implications of certain texts. The absence is suggestive. The library is incomplete, precisely where the historical record indicates that controversial material once circulated widely. This partial survival leaves a tension between what the archaeological evidence reveals and what ancient writers hint once existed. The sense of fragmentation deepens when considering the enigmatic references to a so-called secret Gospel of Mark. This text, mentioned in a disputed letter attributed to Clement of Alexandria, describes passages supposedly intended for mature believers and withheld from general audiences. Scholars continue to debate the authenticity of both the letter and the claims about the extended gospel, but even the debate itself contributes to the larger mystery. If the reference is genuine, it suggests that early Christian communities navigated layers of teaching more complex than the surviving canon reflects. If the reference is forged or misinterpreted, it still highlights how deeply the concept of missing or concealed gospel material has entrenched itself in scholarly discourse. Either way, the unresolved question underscores the difficulty of reconstructing a literary landscape that was actively managed, curated, and occasionally purged. Taken together, these 5 areas reveal a coherent pattern. The apocryphal struggle was not merely a contest of ideas. It was a contest over which narrative of Jesus would define Christian identity. Each suppressed gospel offered a different portrait of the divine, and each posed a threat not because it was fantastical, but because it was plausible enough to command loyalty. The Church, seeking unity, had to narrow the possibilities. This narrowing shaped the canon, but it also created gaps, spaces where alternative traditions once lived, only to be deliberately eliminated or quietly allowed to fade. The implications reverberate through centuries of Christian history. By deciding which Gospels were safe, the Church fundamentally determined which spiritual pathways would remain visible. The vast variety of early Christian thought was compressed into a single authorized framework. Historians examining these disappearances frequently emphasize that the Church did not simply inherit a fixed set of writings, it chose from a diverse body of competing voices. The apocryphal conflict therefore represents not just doctrinal clarification, but the construction of a literary identity. Yet the story does not end with absent manuscripts or destroyed codices. The suppression of texts had social consequences. Communities that relied on forbidden writings often found themselves marginalized or persecuted. Movements built around alternative interpretations of Christ's teachings faced systematic opposition, and the disappearance of certain documents altered the trajectory of Christian spirituality in ways that can only be partially reconstructed. The apocryphal struggle, therefore, functioned as both a theological decision and a political one, shaping who could speak for Christ and who could not. This environment sets the stage for the next escalation. If the Church felt compelled to suppress writings that offered alternative portraits of Jesus, it reacted even more forcefully when confronted with communities whose teachings threatened to crystallize into full-fledged parallel movements. These groups, known later as heresies, did not merely produce dangerous texts, they produced dangerous identities. Their ideas, rituals, and leadership structures challenged the very coherence the Church fought to preserve. The struggle over the Apocrypha thus leads directly, and almost inevitably, into the next chapter, the rise of heresies that refused to disappear, the communities whose beliefs proved resilient despite suppression, and the movements whose remnants still puzzle historians today. Scholars tracing the development of early Christian identity often remark that the Church's struggle with dissident writings inevitably expanded into a struggle with the communities that produced them. Once alternative gospels and disputed teachings were pushed out of the acceptable canon, the next challenge came from movements whose beliefs proved too organized, too persistent, or too widespread to fade with the destruction of their texts. These groups became what later history would label as heresies, but the term conceals their complexity. Many possessed coherent theologies, shared rituals, and strong internal authority, features that made them durable even under pressure. As the Church attempted to secure doctrinal unity, these movements pressed back through persistence, clandestine transmission, and ideas that resonated across borders. Among the first to illustrate this dynamic were the Cathars, whose influence across southern France and parts of northern Italy reached far beyond what official records initially acknowledged. The Albigensian Crusade aimed to eliminate their presence, Yet inquisitorial archives reveal a more intricate aftermath. Some testimonies from converted Cathars, preserved only in fragments or coded entries, show that the authorities encountered beliefs deeply embedded in local culture. Historians examining these documents note a pattern of selective preservation. While the core accusations against Cathar theology remained available, the detailed accounts describing their internal structures, spiritual practices, and theological reasoning became increasingly scarce. This partial survival suggests deliberate shaping of the historical narrative. The records that might have portrayed Cathar thought with nuance appear to have been the quickest to vanish, leaving a version of events dominated by official condemnation rather than a full picture of the beliefs at stake. Further east, another movement challenged ecclesiastical boundaries in ways that proved equally difficult to suppress. The Bogomils, active across the Balkans, developed a cosmology that blended dualistic elements with Christian themes. Surviving references indicate that their text described a struggle between divine forces that extended beyond traditional doctrine, attributing creation's flaws to a rebellious spiritual entity. The Church saw these teachings as dangerously persuasive, since they offered an explanation for suffering that differed sharply from orthodox theology. Efforts to eradicate Bogomil writings proceeded through confiscation, burnings, and directives to prevent future copying. Yet scattered evidence, quotations embedded in opponents' sermons, notes in monastic margins, and unexpected parallels with later dualistic groups indicates that the movement's ideas continued to circulate long after formal suppression. Their cosmology, though targeted relentlessly, proved adaptable enough to survive in altered forms, influencing communities well beyond the regions where the movement first emerged. In Western Europe, the Waldensians presented a different challenge. Emerging from a call for apostolic poverty and lay preaching, their early confessions of faith circulated across the Alps. While the Church condemned their preaching and theology, historians studying manuscript traditions point to traces of confession drafts that appear to have existed in multiple versions. The oddity lies in the gaps. Later medieval writings reference Waldensian statements that no longer have surviving equivalents. Scholars debate whether these missing drafts were lost due to natural decay or actively removed during campaigns to discredit the movement. Some argue that the Waldensians' emphasis on vernacular scripture posed a severe threat to ecclesiastical control and therefore motivated more aggressive suppression. Others propose that political tensions in the regions where they settled contributed to the disappearance. The uncertainty itself reflects a larger pattern. The surviving textual record shows signs of intentional curation rather than a neutral preservation of dissenting voices. Parallel to these Western movements, the so-called Luciferians occupied a peculiar place in late antiquity. Their name, often misunderstood, derived not from diabolical associations, but from allegiance to Lucifer of Cagliari, a bishop who resisted imperial interference in church affairs. The group's writings, according to episcopal criticisms, contained polemics that challenged ecclesiastical reconciliation efforts and accused opposing bishops of compromising with heresy. While only fragments survive, experts emphasize that these remnants reveal a fierce defense of doctrinal purity as the group understood it. The limited survival of their polemical writings hints at a broader corpus that once existed but gradually vanished as their influence waned. The disappearance corresponds with periods of consolidation in church authority, when controlling the narrative surrounding past conflicts became an implicit priority. The remaining fragments therefore stand as isolated witnesses to a theological dispute that larger forces eventually eclipsed. Another example emerges from the Donatist controversy in North Africa. Donatist communities valued purity in clerical office and rejected bishops who had compromised during imperial persecutions. Their movement remained strong for centuries, producing sermons, letters, and theological arguments. Yet modern scholars often encounter only selective pieces of their literature, usually those quoted by opponents, such as Augustine. The persistence of Donatism, despite these gaps, suggests that Donatist writings circulated widely in their own time. The absence of most of these works today has prompted questions about their fate. Some historians propose that local authorities systematically eliminated Donatist texts once the movement weakened politically, Others argue that the later Arab conquests in the region disrupted the survival of Christian writings more broadly. Whatever the cause, the partial disappearance shapes contemporary understanding of the movement through the eyes of its critics, rather than through its own voice. These 5 threads, Catha testimonies, Bogomil cosmology, Waldensian drafts, Luciferian polemics, and Donatist letters, together reveal a landscape where suppression did not rely solely on force, but on control of memory. The Church's approach to heresy often involved more than condemnation. It included shaping the documentary footprint that future generations would inherit. By silencing the movement's internal records, while preserving only the accusations, authorities effectively determined how history would perceive these groups. Some writings were too threatening because they articulated coherent, alternative forms of Christianity. Others were too influential in their immediate communities. Still others provided theological arguments that, if left available, might challenge orthodox interpretations centuries later. In all these cases, the official record was curated to define dissent not by its own terms, but through the framework of orthodoxy that survived. The long-term consequences of this process are profound. Modern historians must reconstruct these movements through the slivers of evidence that remain, piecing together fragments that survived, often by accident. The nature of heresy then becomes a question shaped not only by belief, but by the availability of documentation. What appears extreme or marginal in retrospect may have been more mainstream than the surviving evidence implies. The wider Christian world of late antiquity and the Middle Ages was more diverse, more contested, and more theologically dynamic than later narratives suggest. This dynamic directly influences the next area of suppression. Once the Church had confronted texts and movements, it began confronting individuals whose experiences, visions, or reputations risked gaining too much influence. Some figures were later canonized, others were silenced or erased because their revelations conflicted with established doctrine or threatened the hierarchy's authority. The fate of these visionaries, some revered privately, some condemned publicly, others vanished into forgotten proceedings, represents a new stage in the struggle to control the boundaries of spiritual expression. The transition from collective heresies to individual mystics opens the path to the next chapter, where suppressed saints and silenced visionaries reveal how personal revelation could become as threatening as any text or movement. Historians examining the boundaries of acceptable religious experience have long noted that institutional power confronted not only dissident groups, but also individuals whose visions, writings, or reputations grew beyond what authorities considered manageable. In these cases, the tension did not arise from organized doctrinal opposition, but from personal revelations that carried influence, ambiguity, or unsettling theological implications. The Church, responsible for defining orthodoxy, found itself repeatedly negotiating the complex territory between spiritual inspiration and spiritual threat. One of the most striking examples is the case of Marguerite Porete, a French mystic whose work, The Mirror of Simple Souls, articulated a radical understanding of divine union. Her writing described a soul so fully absorbed in God that it transcended moral categories, an idea that ecclesiastical authorities judged dangerously misleading. Theologians at the time feared that such language could encourage believers to dismiss church teachings on virtue and sin. When questioned, Porete refused to recant, insisting that her descriptions reflected authentic experience rather than rebellion. The resulting condemnation, trial, and execution reveal an institution confronted with a mysticism that bypassed institutional mediation and challenged established frameworks. The banning of her book and the destruction of many copies highlight the perceived threat posed by a single individual whose interior vision could inspire followers outside traditional theological pathways. While Porete's case is documented with unusual clarity, numerous lesser-known figures illustrate similar tensions. Anchorites and recluses, who recorded personal revelations, often found their writings subjected to scrutiny by local clerical authorities. Some accounts that survive in monastic margins show evidence of anonymization, names overwritten, pronouns altered, or passages labeled with corrective notes. Scholars interpreting these modifications argue that the Church attempted to preserve edifying elements while removing the identity or influence of certain visionaries whose authority risked overshadowing institutional oversight. In some cases, the original author cannot be identified at all. Only the content remains, stripped of context. This process suggests a meticulous approach. Spiritual insights that aligned with doctrine could be retained, but the voices behind them could be muted to prevent the rise of unauthorized authority. Other instances demonstrate a more direct dismissal of visionary claims, deemed disruptive. Reports of visions occasionally contradicted official positions on theological matters, or implied divine endorsement of reforms the Church was unwilling to consider. Inquisitorial and episcopal records describe moments where clerical investigators evaluated alleged revelations not for their devotional value, but for their potential to destabilize communities. When visions suggested new interpretations of Scripture, corrections to ecclesiastical hierarchy, or challenges to moral teachings, authorities intervened swiftly. Historians studying these documents note that even sincere spiritual experiences could be classified as erroneous or dangerous. The suppression of certain accounts therefore reflects institutional concerns that went beyond orthodoxy, touching on social cohesion and political control. The most elusive cases involve individuals whose reputations reached the threshold of sainthood, yet left behind trails of documentation that either fragment abruptly or vanish entirely. Medieval canonization processes required lengthy investigations, testimonies, and written records. In several instances, references to such proceedings exist, but key documents are missing. One example involves a 12th century candidate whose inquest appears in scattered citations by later clerics, but does not survive in complete form. Scholars debate whether the disappearance resulted from bureaucratic loss or intentional removal. Some suggest that the individual's visions or miracles may have conflicted with evolving theological positions. Others argue that the social environment surrounding the figure, regional conflicts, contested authority, or political alliances may have influenced the decision to halt the canonization and allow its records to fade. The uncertainty underscores how the Church's archival silence can shape historical memory as decisively as any explicit condemnation. These four strands: horrid suppression, the anonymization of anchorite revelations, the dismissal of destabilizing visions, and the disappearance of an early canonization record, reveal a consistent dynamic. Institutional authorities were not only concerned with written doctrine or organized movements, they also monitored the spiritual authority of individuals. Mystical experience, even when sincere or theologically cautious, carried the potential to circumvent established channels of authority. A visionary who claimed divine instruction posed unique challenges because personal revelation is inherently difficult to regulate. When the content aligned with ecclesiastical aims, such figures might eventually be canonized. When it diverged, the response ranged from corrective editing to complete erasure. The historical consequences of this regulation are significant. The medieval Christian landscape, often perceived as dominated by monastic and clerical voices, was also shaped by women and men whose mystical writings circulated informally through communities. The partial survival of these writings offers only glimpses of the creativity, diversity, and tension present in religious life. Scholars who attempt to reconstruct these lost or altered texts face a documentary field shaped not by neutral preservation but by selective survival. The absence of certain voices, whether due to destruction, anonymization, or procedural disappearance, means that modern understandings of Christian mysticism are filtered through the decisions made by authorities centuries ago. The broader implications extend beyond individual cases. When visionaries disappeared from the record, the Church simultaneously defined the acceptable boundaries of mysticism, experiences emphasizing obedience, humility, and alignment with doctrinal norms found institutional support. Experiences emphasizing direct union with God, autonomous spiritual authority, or critiques of ecclesiastical practice faced heightened scrutiny. This dialectic shaped what later generations would recognize as the mystical tradition, leaving a canon of spiritual literature that appears more uniform than the diverse historical reality. The patterns revealed here naturally lead to the next domain of suppression, one rooted not in individuals but in the machinery designed to enforce doctrinal uniformity. The inquisitorial courts, established to identify and eliminate heresy, generated vast archives containing testimonies, confessions, and records of spiritual experiences. Within those archives lie moments where personal revelations intersected with institutional prosecution, deepening the tension between spiritual authenticity and ecclesiastical control. Yet many of these documents remain sealed, fragmented, or lost, giving rise to an even darker chapter in the history of suppression. Thus, the story of silenced visionaries provides the threshold for the next investigation, the shadowed files of the Inquisition, where the boundaries between spiritual danger, political necessity, and narrative control become even more difficult to disentangle. Historians studying the machinery of religious authority frequently note that the Inquisition did not simply prosecute heresy, it generated an immense documentary footprint that reveals both the ambitions and the anxieties of the institutional church. Yet this archive, vast as it once was, offers only a fractured view of the past. Large portions of its records have been sealed, redacted, reinterpreted, or allowed to disappear. The surviving evidence suggests that inquisitorial documentation was shaped not only by judicial necessity, but also by deliberate attempts to manage the memory of what transpired. In this shadowed terrain, the boundaries between administrative caution and intentional suppression become increasingly difficult to distinguish. One of the most revealing aspects of the inquisitorial system lies in its handling of torture transcripts. Ecclesiastical authorities justified coercive interrogation under tightly defined conditions, but the resulting testimonies were considered volatile. Scholars examining early inquisitorial manuals note that certain confessions were preserved only in restricted registers marked for limited circulation. In other cases, scribes copied the procedural details but omitted the prisoner's more disturbing theological claims, leaving only the accusations and final judgments. The existence of sealed bundles from specific tribunals indicates that officials recognized the danger inherent in documenting spiritual or doctrinal irregularities extracted under duress. These transcripts, inaccessible for centuries, underscore the tension between legal transparency and the fear that unfiltered testimony might circulate beyond controlled environments. Their restricted status demonstrates an institutional awareness of how words spoken under pressure could reshape perceptions of heresy, doctrine, or ecclesiastical authority itself. A further layer of complexity emerges with the earliest years of the Spanish Inquisition, a period for which records should be abundant, but instead contain conspicuous absences. Historians studying the administrative correspondence have identified mentions of confessions and investigative proceedings that no longer exist in the central archive. Some of these missing documents involve high-profile cases whose outcomes remain known only through indirect references. Scholars debate whether political instability in the early years of the tribunal contributed to the loss, or whether certain files were removed due to their sensitivity. The disappearance of these testimonies creates an asymmetry. While the institution's authority is well documented, the experiences of the accused often survive only through second-hand accounts, shaping the narrative in ways aligned with official perspectives rather than a complete historical record. Alongside these vanished testimonies appear traces of demonological material that inquisitors occasionally encountered but rarely preserved openly. Manuals from the period acknowledge that interrogators sometimes received reports of alleged encounters with malevolent entities, unusual spiritual phenomena, or localized rituals that blurred the line between folklore and heterodoxy. While some of these accounts entered trial records, others were isolated in internal ledgers categorized as dangerous or speculative. Scholars studying these marginal notes argue that certain descriptions were suppressed because they risked legitimizing beliefs the Church wished to eradicate. By containing these testimonies in sealed or little circulated files, inquisitorial authorities attempted to prevent the dissemination of narratives that might fuel fascination with demonology, or appear to grant undue seriousness to practices deemed superstitious or heterodox. A related pattern appears in documents describing the questioning of converted scholars, intellectuals whose prior training equipped them to challenge doctrinal orthodoxy with unusual sophistication. Inquisitorial registers occasionally reference interrogations where such individuals raised complex arguments concerning scripture, philosophy, or theology. While the existence of these dialogues is acknowledged, the detailed content is often absent from official archives. Historians analyzing these gaps propose that the Church may have deemed some arguments too subtle or persuasive for inclusion in public records, preserving only the accusations and the ultimate abjurations. Authorities ensured that the intellectual challenges themselves did not continue to circulate. This selective documentation reinforces the idea that the Inquisition functioned as both a judicial and a narrative institution, managing not only behavior but interpretation. Yet perhaps the clearest indication of deliberate censorship lies in the orders issued to destroy intercepted correspondence deemed heretical. Letters discovered during investigations sometimes revealed networks of dissent, theological debates, or coded exchanges between communities suspected of maintaining forbidden doctrines. When such material came into inquisitorial custody, officials occasionally mandated its destruction rather than preservation. Surviving administrative directives explicitly instruct agents to eliminate letters considered spiritually harmful or strategically dangerous. The rationale, according to later commentary, rested on the belief that written words held the power to perpetuate error long after individuals repented or movements declined. By eradicating these communications, authorities aimed to prevent the ideas within them from influencing future generations. This practice of preemptive elimination illustrates the breadth of the inquisitorial mandate. Suppression of texts was not limited to formal treatises, but extended to personal correspondence capable of sustaining dissent. Taken together, these patterns create a portrait of the Inquisition that differs markedly from the image presented in many popular narratives. Rather than operating solely through trials, penances, and confessions, the institution also exerted control over the flow of information. The records that survive today are the result of multiple layers of selection, decisions made by inquisitors, archivists, and later custodians about what should endure. The silences in the archive are therefore as significant as the surviving documents. They reveal areas where institutional caution, political sensitivity, or theological concern influenced the preservation of evidence. The gaps, redactions, and sealed files reflect a desire not merely to enforce orthodoxy, but to shape the historical memory of how orthodoxy was enforced. The consequences of this selective preservation extend into modern scholarship. Researchers attempting to reconstruct the beliefs of accused individuals encounter an archive meticulously curated to present the official version of events. Testimonies extracted under interrogation are preserved when they support condemnation, yet those containing theological nuance or discomforting complexity tend to vanish or remain inaccessible. Demonological notes provide hints of cultural practices that authorities wished to suppress without publicizing. Missing confessions from early tribunals complicate efforts to understand the institutional evolution of the Inquisition. Destroyed letters ensure that some networks of dissent will never be fully mapped. The result is a documentary landscape where the most unsettling material appears at the periphery, in fragments, or in references to documents that no longer exist. These dynamics reveal an institution deeply invested in managing not only doctrine, but the world of written words that surrounded it. The machinery of suppression, in this context, becomes inseparable from the machinery of record-keeping. The Inquisition's archive stands as both a monumental resource and an engineered artifact, preserving certain visions of the past, while allowing others to fade into obscurity. This interplay between authority and secrecy naturally opens the way toward another dimension of ecclesiastical control. Internal directives, that circulated within the Vatican itself. These texts, sometimes withheld even from lower clergy, shaped decisions about censorship, investigation, and the handling of controversial materials. The shift from judicial records to the quiet power of internal orders marks the transition to the next phase of this broader historical pattern, where suppression becomes embedded not only in public trials, but in the administrative bloodstream of the Church. Scholars examining the centralization of ecclesiastical authority often emphasize that some of the most consequential acts of censorship in Church history did not occur in courts, public decrees, or theological condemnations, but within the silent corridors of administration. Long before decisions reached the eyes of the faithful, they passed through layers of internal directives that shaped how controversial materials were to be handled, circulated, or suppressed. These orders reveal a world where debates over dangerous knowledge took place behind closed doors, with only faint traces visible in the surviving record. Taken together, they show an institution fine-tuning its mechanisms for controlling information long before public controversies erupted. Among the earliest examples are secret papal briefs, detailing the procedures for censoring writings deemed harmful. These documents, circulated only among select officials, clarified how bishops and inquisitors were to manage prohibited texts. Archivists who have studied the limited surviving samples note that these briefs did not merely outline categories of forbidden material. They offered guidance on how to confiscate works discreetly and minimize public awareness of their existence. The tone suggests an effort to prevent circulation, not only of the texts themselves, but of knowledge about their suppression. This administrative layer illustrates how censorship operated through strategies that sought to avoid open conflict. By establishing internal protocols, the Church ensured consistency in its approach to dangerous ideas without provoking the widespread attention that public condemnation might attract. Alongside these censorship procedures existed a parallel strand of directives addressing contested relics. Throughout the medieval and early modern periods, debates arose over the authenticity of objects associated with saints, biblical figures, and sacred events. While some controversies were public, others were managed quietly through instructions sent to clergy responsible for local shrines. These orders sometimes required the removal of relics whose authenticity could not be guaranteed, or whose presence risked encouraging unorthodox interpretations. Scholars have uncovered cases where inventories were updated to eliminate references to disputed items, effectively erasing the controversy from official memory. The internal nature of these directives suggests that the Church sometimes preferred to resolve sensitive matters privately, rather than invite public speculation. In doing so, it maintained doctrinal coherence while sidestepping the potential fallout of openly acknowledging uncertainty. A third dimension emerges in the Church's handling of medieval thinkers, whose writings pushed against the boundaries of accepted theology. Some intellectuals explored natural philosophy, scriptural interpretation, or mystical speculation in ways that raised concerns among ecclesiastical authorities. Internal warnings about such figures circulated, instructing clerics to monitor their influence or restrict the copying of their manuscripts. While some authors eventually faced formal condemnation, others were contained through administrative caution alone. Historians examining these warnings report that they often included assessments of a thinker's potential impact on lay audiences or clerical formation. The underlying logic treated intellectual innovation as a double-edged sword, valuable when aligned with doctrine, but destabilizing when it ventured too far. These internal evaluations demonstrate how the Church sought to control the intellectual environment without necessarily engaging in public dispute. The most elusive of these administrative documents concerns a vanished papal bull addressing esoteric fraternities. References to the bull appear in later commentaries, but the document itself has not survived. Debate continues over whether the bull was ever promulgated or whether it was withdrawn before reaching wider circulation. Some scholars suggest that the text aimed to regulate groups whose blend of Christian symbolism and esoteric practice posed challenges to ecclesiastical discipline. Others argue that the bull may have been part of a broader effort to counter movements perceived as blurring the line between piety and occultism. The absence of the document, coupled with inconsistent references in secondary sources, leaves its content largely speculative. Its disappearance, however, fits a broader pattern in which potentially controversial administrative decisions were allowed to fade from official memory when their enforcement proved impractical or politically sensitive. Against this backdrop of missing or secretive directives, one set of materials stands out for its constrained circulation: anti-heresy manuals intended for clergy involved in identifying doctrinal deviation. These texts provided guidelines on recognizing heterodox beliefs, questioning suspects, and responding to ambiguous cases. While some manuals were widely used, others were restricted to specific officials because they contained detailed examples of heretical reasoning that authorities feared might inspire curiosity among untrained readers. Scholars studying these restricted volumes note that they often included extracts of forbidden writings, summaries of unorthodox arguments, and instructions for handling especially dangerous ideas. By limiting access to these manuals, the Church sought to equip certain officials while preventing the spread of knowledge deemed too risky for general circulation. This selective dissemination reflects a sophisticated understanding of how information itself could influence belief. Together, these 5 dimensions: private censorship briefs, directives on contested relics, internal warnings about medieval thinkers, the vanished bull on esoteric fraternities, and restricted anti-heresy manuals reveal a church increasingly adept at governing information through administrative channels. Suppression, in this context, did not rely solely on public prohibition. It operated through a network of instructions designed to forestall controversy, avoid schism, and quietly manage risks. The existence of such directives suggests that the Church saw the flow of information as a delicate system requiring continuous oversight. By shaping what clergy could read, circulate, or even acknowledge, ecclesiastical leadership maintained a controlled intellectual environment that could be adjusted without attracting attention. The long-term implications of these internal orders extend far beyond their immediate administrative purpose. Historians note that the selective survival of these documents has profoundly influenced modern understandings of how censorship functioned. The disappearance of certain directives, especially those involving sensitive matters, creates interpretive gaps that can only be filled through indirect evidence. The very existence of restricted materials points to discussions and decisions now largely lost. These absences shape the questions scholars can ask and limit the narratives they can construct. The surviving fragments testify to a sophisticated bureaucracy that recognized the power of not only doctrine but documentation. This administrative shadow world laid the groundwork for later institutions dedicated to evaluating spiritual phenomena. Once internal directives established methods for controlling texts, relics, and ideas, a parallel need arose to evaluate claims of divine intervention. Miraculous events, apparitions, and extraordinary phenomena required careful assessment because they could inspire devotion or sow confusion. The transition from administrative control to investigative caution marks the beginning of the next phase, where the Church confronted miracles that proved too politically charged, medically perplexing, or theologically ambiguous to validate openly. As the boundaries between private directives and public judgment blurred, the stage was set for a new dimension of suppression, one not concerned merely with texts or intellectual speculation, but with the inexplicable events that believers claimed to witness. Those cases, often recorded only partially or withheld entirely, form the core of the next chapter, the miracles the Church chose not to recognize, and the reasons those decisions still echo through historical debates. Historians examining the Church's evaluation of miraculous claims often emphasize that decisions surrounding supernatural phenomena reveal not only theological concerns, but also political, social, and cultural pressures. Miracles have always occupied an uneasy position within ecclesiastical structures. They inspire devotion, strengthen communal identity, and affirm sanctity. Yet they also risk encouraging interpretations that lie beyond institutional control. When an alleged miracle generated controversy, attracted unwanted attention, or challenged doctrinal clarity, the Church often responded with extreme caution. The pattern that emerges from this history is defined not by overt condemnation, but by a mixture of silence, archival obscurity, and decisions that restricted recognition while allowing the events themselves to fade into ambiguity. One of the clearest examples of this dynamic involves a bleeding icon investigated during a period of political instability. The event drew considerable attention from local populations, who interpreted the phenomenon as a sign of divine intervention in ongoing conflicts. Ecclesiastical officials, however, recognized the danger of allowing the event to fuel partisan sentiment. The icon, according to surviving reports, underwent examination, but the results were never publicized. Instead, the investigation concluded with an implicit denial. The case was neither recognized as miraculous nor declared fraudulent. The icon was quietly removed from public veneration, and references to it diminished over time. Scholars interpreting this episode argue that the ambiguity served a deliberate purpose. By withholding recognition, the Church avoided inflaming tensions. By avoiding explicit condemnation, it prevented accusations of suppressing divine messages. The case demonstrates how political context could influence decisions that were ostensibly theological. Another instance arises from an apparition reported during a schism that divided regional clergy. The visionary claims appeared at a moment when rival factions sought legitimacy, and the reported messages carried implications that could be interpreted as supporting one side over the other. The Church, confronted with potential misuse of the event, initiated an investigation but maintained a guarded approach. Contemporary notes indicate that investigators expressed concern about the apparition's timing and potential manipulation. The case ultimately remained unresolved, buried within diocesan files that later historians had difficulty accessing. The lack of formal validation reflects a broader strategy. Supernatural claims emerging in contested political environments were considered too vulnerable to exploitation to receive public approval. The Church's caution illustrates the interplay between spiritual discernment and institutional stability. Similar caution appears in a stigmatic case that raised unusual medical questions. The individual reportedly exhibited marks resembling the wounds of Christ, but medical examiners noted patterns inconsistent with known cases of stigmata. The Church, aware of the growing fascination surrounding the figure, hesitated to endorse phenomena that might later be interpreted as deceptive or misunderstood. The investigation produced detailed observations, yet the conclusions were never circulated beyond a small group of officials. Historians studying fragments of the report emphasize the ambiguity. The case was not dismissed outright, but neither was it allowed to influence devotional practices. The decision to withhold validation reflects both medical uncertainty and concern about encouraging cultic devotion around a figure whose experiences remained difficult to interpret conclusively. The withholding of recognition therefore served to protect theological credibility at a moment when the boundaries between physical and spiritual explanation were still being negotiated. Another case reveals an even more opaque process, an investigation into a reported miracle abruptly suspended without explanation. Archival references confirm that an inquiry had begun and that testimonies were collected, yet the documentation ends mid-process. No final judgment survives, and later administrative records indicate that the file was never reopened. Scholars examining this discontinuity propose several possible explanations: internal disagreement among investigators, shifting political conditions, or new information that complicated the narrative. Regardless of the cause, the abrupt halt suggests an assessment that continuing the investigation posed risks greater than concluding it. The disappearance of the final evaluation transforms the event into a historical enigma, its status uncertain and its implications unresolved. This absence of closure highlights how silence itself functioned as a form of regulation, preventing an event from entering the canon of approved miracles, while avoiding the conflict that a public rejection might provoke. Taken together, these 4 cases reveal a nuanced approach to miraculous phenomena. The Church did not simply classify events as true or false. It managed them within a framework shaped by doctrine, politics, medicine, and pastoral concerns. Miracles that threatened to destabilize communities, reinforce partisan divisions, attract unregulated devotion, or introduce theological ambiguity were handled with caution. Silence, ambiguity, and restricted circulation of findings often served as tools of governance. In this sense, the evaluation of miracles mirrors earlier patterns seen in the suppression of texts and ideas. Danger was defined not only by content, but by the potential consequences of allowing certain narratives to spread. This cautious approach shaped the long-term record. Modern historians attempting to reconstruct these cases work with incomplete documentation, indirect references, and occasional hints in personal correspondence. The absence of explicit judgments limits understanding of how investigators reached their conclusions. The resulting ambiguity contributes to a broader sense of the hidden dimensions of ecclesiastical decision-making. Miracles that were never recognized officially exist today as shadows, events significant enough to warrant investigation, but ultimately judged too ambiguous or too disruptive to enter the official narrative. These stories of withheld recognition also influence modern perceptions of sanctity and supernatural intervention. The Church's hesitance demonstrates an awareness that miraculous claims, once validated, become part of the spiritual imagination of communities for generations. Therefore, recognition required not only evidence, but confidence that the event aligned with broader theological and social priorities. By controlling which events received official approval, the Church shaped devotional practices, safeguarded institutional stability, and maintained coherence in the understanding of divine action. This dynamic of cautious suppression leads directly to a more tangible domain of vanished authority, the world of relics, whose authenticity, power, or implications risked creating doctrinal confusion. As with miraculous phenomena, relics carried enormous influence in shaping belief, attracting pilgrims, and reinforcing communal identity. Their disappearance, whether through quiet removal, destruction, or unexplained loss, marks the next phase of the historical pattern, where physical objects rather than visionary experiences became the focus of contested interpretation. The transition from unvalidated miracles to vanished relics reveals a continuous thread in the Church's approach to dangerous ambiguities. When a phenomenon or object threatened to reshape devotional life in unpredictable ways, institutional caution often prevailed. The next chapter explores this dynamic in greater depth, tracing the fate of relics that disappeared under circumstances, suggesting that theological risk, political conflict, or doctrinal uncertainty made their continued existence untenable. Historians, tracing the trajectory of Christian material culture, consistently emphasize that relics played a central role in shaping devotional practice, ecclesiastical authority, and popular imagination. These objects, whether fragments of the true cross, possessions of saints, or artifacts associated with biblical events, were more than physical remains. They functioned as points of contact between the earthly and the sacred. Because relics attracted pilgrims, inspired veneration, and conferred legitimacy upon the institutions that housed them, their authenticity and interpretation held enormous influence. For this reason, relics that provoked doctrinal confusion, political rivalries, or spiritual controversy often became the subject of subtle suppression, removal, or disappearance. When a relic's existence threatened to destabilize, rather than strengthen the Church's authority, the response was frequently to limit its visibility and ultimately erase its presence from the historical record. One of the most instructive examples concerns the cataloguing of fragments of the true cross. Medieval inventories once recorded numerous pieces distributed across churches and monasteries throughout Europe. Over time, however, scholars have noticed a gap in surviving catalogues. A comprehensive inventory that should have listed the full range of recognized fragments no longer exists, though indirect references confirm that such a document was once maintained. Experts studying these references argue that inconsistencies between claimed fragments and theological expectations likely prompted a re-evaluation of the catalogue. Some fragments carried legends that could not be reconciled with church teaching. Others were tied to politically charged patronage networks. The eventual disappearance of the catalogue suggests a decision to prevent contentious debates about authenticity. By allowing the document to vanish, ecclesiastical authorities effectively limited the scope of controversy and preserved doctrinal coherence without confronting the problem publicly. A different kind of disappearance surrounds a copy of the Holy Lance, a relic believed in various traditions to have pierced the side of Christ. Multiple regions claimed possession of such a spear, each with its own narrative of transmission. In one instance, authorities determined that a particular copy, though venerated locally, generated confusion about its legitimacy. Surviving records indicate that the relic was examined, deemed problematic, and slated for removal. The directive leading to its destruction appears in administrative notes, emphasizing the need to avoid dangerous confusion. The phrasing suggests that the relic's existence risked undermining the status of other, more officially endorsed versions. By eliminating the contested object, the Church preserved a hierarchy of authenticity that supported established traditions rather than introducing ambiguity that might erode devotional trust. The disappearance of another relic, one associated with the Theotokos, illustrates a more complex interplay between piety, politics, and doctrinal caution. Several medieval sources refer to an object believed to have belonged to Mary, though the nature of the item varies across accounts. While some describe a garment, others mention a personal object preserved in a specific region. The surviving descriptions are fragmentary and inconsistent, prompting debate among historians regarding the relic's identity and provenance. What is more telling than the object itself is its sudden disappearance from official records. The inconsistency between competing traditions may have rendered the relic too controversial to maintain. Some scholars propose that ecclesiastical authorities chose to remove it from veneration to prevent divergent interpretations of Marian devotion from spreading, especially at a time when theological reflection on Mary's role was undergoing significant development. The relic's vanishing underscores how doctrinal evolution could influence decisions about which material traces of the sacred were preserved and which were quietly withdrawn. Another example involves the suppression of a disputed set of bones attributed to a local saint. These remains had attracted regional devotion, yet ecclesiastical visitors expressed concerns not only about their authenticity, but also about the fervent practices surrounding them. When doubts grew about whether the bones truly belonged to the saint in question, church authorities ordered their removal. Some documentation describes efforts to relocate them to a place where they would no longer receive public attention. Historians analyzing these reports emphasize that the action was less about fraud than about managing devotional energy that had grown difficult to regulate. The removal prevented further disputes and re-established control over local religious expressions, ensuring that veneration remained aligned with accepted forms of sanctity rather than being driven by contested traditions. Perhaps the most enigmatic case involves a relic chest, mentioned once in a monastic inventory and never recorded again. The inventory's brief description suggests that the chest contained multiple items associated with early Christian martyrs, yet its subsequent disappearance raises questions about its contents and significance. Scholars propose various explanations: accidental loss during periods of upheaval, deliberate removal by custodians concerned about the authenticity of the items, or the possibility that the relics carried associations deemed theologically problematic. The absence of any follow-up references prevents definitive conclusions, but the silence itself is revealing. The vanished chest represents an entire category of relic-related mysteries, objects that appear fleetingly in records before fading from view, leaving only hints of what they once contained. These 5 strands together illuminate a broader pattern. Relics were not merely holy artifacts, but instruments of spiritual authority, and their preservation or disappearance was often guided by institutional priorities. When relics reinforced accepted narratives, they were celebrated, displayed, and integrated into liturgical life. When they introduced ambiguity, threatened hierarchies, or risked conflicting interpretations, the Church sometimes chose quiet removal over public controversy. This dynamic reflects a larger strategy aimed at maintaining coherence in the devotional imagination while minimizing opportunities for dissent or confusion. The consequences of these decisions extend into the present. Modern historians attempting to reconstruct the history of specific relics frequently encounter incomplete records, conflicting accounts, or gaps created by deliberate suppression. The absence of comprehensive catalogues, the destruction of contested objects, and the silence surrounding disappeared relics complicate efforts to understand how communities interpreted the sacred. These gaps remind scholars that the material history of Christianity is shaped not only by what survived, but also by what was allowed to disappear. They highlight the fragility of relic traditions and the extent to which institutional decisions determined which physical traces of the sacred endured. At the same time, the disappearance of relics intersects with broader historical processes, including political conflict, regional variation in devotional practice, and changes in theological emphasis. Relics tied to contested narratives or localized traditions often faced heightened scrutiny. Their removal served to align devotional life with larger ecclesiastical aims, ensuring that the material expression of faith reflected unified doctrine rather than fragmented or contradictory traditions. The interplay between relics and authority thus reveals a church attentive to the power of physical objects to shape spiritual belief and communal identity. This world of vanished relics lays the groundwork for another chapter in the history of suppressed knowledge, one rooted not in physical objects, but in intellectual inquiry. As theologians, scientists, and scholars explored natural philosophy, astronomy, and other fields, their ideas sometimes crossed boundaries the Church considered essential. The tension between intellectual curiosity and doctrinal stability produced its own form of suppression, shaping the development of scientific thought and the limits of permissible inquiry. The transition from relics to forbidden sciences marks the next stage in this complex pattern, where ideas rather than objects became the focus of institutional concern. Historians examining the evolution of European intellectual life consistently note that tensions between theological boundaries and scholarly inquiry did not emerge suddenly during the Renaissance, but trace back to earlier centuries when the Church sought to guide, correct, and sometimes restrict the expanding curiosity of Christian thinkers. The desire to protect doctrine, preserve unity, and prevent misinterpretation often placed ecclesiastical authorities in the position of determining which intellectual paths were safe to follow and which risked unsettling the spiritual and philosophical foundations of the faith. The resulting landscape of forbidden sciences is not defined by blanket hostility to knowledge. Many clerics were themselves scientists, but rather by a carefully negotiated boundary between inquiry that deepened Christian understanding and inquiry that threatened the coherence of the theological worldview. One of the most emblematic examples of this dynamic appears in the treatment of early heliocentric manuscripts. Before the more famous controversies of the early modern period, duplicated copies of works proposing a sun-centered cosmos circulated quietly among scholars. Ecclesiastical authorities, aware that such models contradicted prevailing interpretations of Scripture, responded not with immediate public condemnation, but with targeted restrictions. Manuscript traditions reveal instances in which regional clerics confiscated or prohibited further copying of texts that advanced heliocentric ideas. The concern was not only theological, but also pastoral, the fear that cosmological revisions might erode confidence in scriptural interpretation at a time when intellectual frameworks were deeply intertwined with religious identity. By suppressing certain manuscripts at the level of circulation rather than doctrine, the Church attempted to prevent premature exposure to ideas that could generate confusion before their implications were fully understood. A related tension emerges in the field of anatomical research. While the Church permitted and at times encouraged, medical studies. Certain forms of dissection or investigation into the human body provoked unease. Scholars examining medieval and early Renaissance medical faculties note that ecclesiastical guidelines varied across regions, but some restrictions were motivated by concerns that anatomical exploration could challenge traditional teachings about the nature of life, death, and the soul. When research entered territories considered irreverent or speculative, authorities intervened to curtail practices deemed incompatible with theological anthropology. The resulting limitations ensured that certain discoveries advanced slowly, not because clerics rejected medical knowledge, but because they sought to maintain a clear boundary between empirical observation and metaphysical interpretation. This tension reveals a church negotiating the meaning of embodiment at a moment when scientific curiosity was accelerating. In parallel, astrological treatises circulated widely across Europe, often blending astronomical calculation with predictive or mystical claims. While some forms of astrology were tolerated, particularly those connected to medical diagnosis, the Church condemned interpretations suggesting that celestial movements dictated human destiny. Authorities feared that such beliefs undermined free will, divine providence, and moral responsibility. As a result, several astrological manuscripts were suppressed, restricted to academic circles, or labeled dangerous when their claims overstepped theological limits. Historians studying these texts observe that many survive only because they were copied in secret or preserved under neutral titles. The boundaries drawn around astrology illustrate a broader principle. Intellectual exploration was acceptable when it clarified nature or supported medicine, but not when it threatened to replace divine governance with mechanistic determinism. Another dimension appears in suppressed mathematical writings that challenged established cosmology. Some thinkers used geometric reasoning or philosophical argumentation to critique traditional models of the universe. While not all such speculation attracted censure, certain works that proposed radical revisions, particularly those resembling pre-modern forms of atomism or infinite universe theory, were flagged by ecclesiastical readers as problematic. Surviving marginalia in monastic manuscripts reveal warnings written by cautious scribes advising future readers to approach certain sections with skepticism or avoid them entirely. Historians interpret these annotations as evidence of a tension between admiration for mathematical elegance and concern that abstract reasoning might erode the hierarchical, purpose-driven cosmos central to medieval theology. The suppression of some of these commentaries reflects a desire to ensure that speculative thought remained tethered to accepted metaphysical principles. The most understated yet pervasive form of suppression involved limits placed on speculative natural philosophy. Medieval scholars often pursued questions about the composition of matter, the structure of the heavens, or the operation of natural forces. Ecclesiastical authorities tended to tolerate such inquiry until it drifted toward explanations that marginalized divine action or challenged doctrinal teachings. Treatises proposing autonomous natural processes or describing the world in mechanistic terms were scrutinized carefully. In some cases, they were allowed to circulate only in restricted academic settings. In others, copying was discouraged or halted entirely. The concern lay not in scientific curiosity itself, but in the implications such theories held for the relationship between creation and creator. Scholars examining these suppressed texts note that their authors rarely intended doctrinal conflict. Rather, the philosophical consequences of their reasoning placed them on unstable ground. The Church's response demonstrates a commitment to preserving a worldview in which scientific explanation complemented rather than replaced theological understanding. These 5 strands reveal a complex relationship between faith and inquiry. Contrary to modern caricatures, the Church functioned not simply as an obstacle to scientific progress, but as an institution shaping the intellectual boundaries within which that progress occurred. Suppression often arose not from hostility to knowledge, but from anxiety about how new ideas might be interpreted, misapplied, or weaponized. The concern was that premature or unregulated exposure to certain theories could generate doctrinal instability or spiritual confusion. By controlling the circulation of controversial manuscripts, limiting certain investigative practices, and scrutinizing speculative reasoning, ecclesiastical authorities attempted to safeguard the metaphysical architecture that underpinned Christian thought. These decisions had lasting consequences. Some scientific developments advanced more slowly because they lacked open institutional support. Certain fields struggled to define themselves independently from theological frameworks. Intellectual traditions that might have flourished earlier instead evolved cautiously, shaped by boundaries that reflected both devotional priorities and social structures. Yet the same constraints created a unique environment in which science and philosophy interacted intimately with theology, producing insights that might not have emerged in a fully secularized context. The interplay between restriction and encouragement generated a distinctive intellectual culture, neither purely confining nor entirely permissive. This environment sets the stage for the next layer of suppressed knowledge, one rooted not in philosophical inquiry, but in small, internally divergent groups that developed radical interpretations of Christian life and practice. While these movements lacked the institutional reach of major heresies, their ideas often blended asceticism, mysticism, and unorthodox speculation in ways that unsettled ecclesiastical authorities. Their existence underscores a different facet of suppressed history, the tension between official doctrine and grassroots reinterpretations of Christian identity. As the boundaries of acceptable inquiry continued to shift, the Church faced the challenge of managing groups whose practices carried a mixture of fervor, innovation, and danger. The transition from forbidden sciences to these obscure Christian cults marks the next chapter in the broader historical pattern, where suppression addressed not intellectual speculation alone, but the unpredictable dynamics of alternative spiritual communities. Historians studying the diversity of medieval Christianity often point out that alongside major doctrinal controversies and philosophical debates existed a series of much smaller, more fragmentary groups whose practices placed them in ambiguous territory. These communities rarely produced extensive writings, and their membership often shifted across generations, but their ideas left traces in ecclesiastical correspondence, local chronicles, and scattered condemnations. What unites these groups is not a common theology, but a shared capacity to unsettle authorities through the intensity of their beliefs, the extremity of their rituals, or the unpredictability of their influence on surrounding populations. The Church, already tasked with managing heresy, found itself dealing with these micro-movements, whose doctrines were less systematic than disruptive, and whose practices sometimes blurred the boundary between radical piety and theological error. One significant example involves a spiritual group whose views verged toward eugenic-like interpretations of purity. Surviving descriptions, preserved largely in hostile sources, portray a community convinced that spiritual elevation required strict separation from those deemed morally or ritually impure. Although the movement lacked formal doctrinal texts, its practices suggested an attempt to cultivate a superior moral lineage through selective association. Ecclesiastical authorities judged these beliefs incompatible with Christian teaching on human dignity and universal redemption. Their response consisted not of a grand public condemnation, but of a targeted decree disbanding the group and forbidding further gatherings. The lack of surviving internal documents reflects how quickly the movement dissolved under pressure, yet its existence testifies to the spectrum of ideas that could emerge when ascetic impulses merged with speculative anthropology. The Church's intervention demonstrates a concern that such radical exclusivism, if allowed to grow, could disrupt social cohesion and distort theological principles. Another example concerns extreme penitential sects, whose practices intensified conventional asceticism to dangerous levels. These groups adopted mortification rituals that alarmed clergy responsible for pastoral care. Ecclesiastical visitors documented cases in which members engaged in continuous fasting, self-inflicted pain, or public displays of penance so severe that they endangered physical health. While individual acts of asceticism were often celebrated within Christian tradition, these groups institutionalized extreme practices in ways that bypassed ecclesiastical oversight. Clerics attempting to intervene encountered communities convinced that divine favor required ever-increasing measures of bodily discipline. Their suppression relied on direct pastoral correction, as well as broader measures intended to discourage imitation. Historians analyzing these interventions emphasize that the Church's concern centered not only on physical harm, but also on the potential for these practices to develop into parallel paths to sanctity outside established structures. A more mysterious case revolves around a mystic communal order that appears briefly in several medieval sources, before vanishing from the historical record. The references describe a group that combined contemplative prayer with esoteric symbolism, drawing inspiration from both monastic traditions and local folklore. Some accounts suggest that they developed unique forms of ritual that blended Christian imagery with metaphorical interpretations of natural cycles. Ecclesiastical authorities expressed unease about the group's independence and the opacity of its teachings. When inquiries were made, officials encountered resistance from members unwilling to disclose their spiritual practices. Subsequent documents imply that efforts were taken to dissolve the community and integrate its members into more conventional religious life. The absence of surviving texts from the group itself complicates attempts to reconstruct its beliefs. Its disappearance hints at a form of suppression aimed not at eradicating dangerous doctrine, but at absorbing or neutralizing spiritual movements that resisted institutional structure. Another instance emerges from the burning of prophetic writings produced by a splinter sect, whose visions circulated among marginal communities. These texts, now lost, reportedly contained apocalyptic predictions framed in symbolic language that authorities feared might ignite social unrest. The sect's prophets drew attention with claims that divine revelations mandated significant changes in communal life. Local clergy documented the spread of these ideas and reported them to higher authorities, who ordered the confiscation and destruction of the manuscripts. The suppression appears to have relied on controlling the physical circulation of the prophecies rather than prosecuting individual adherents. Historians examining these accounts observe that the Church viewed the texts as more dangerous than the community itself, recognizing the power of written prophecy to influence readers far beyond the group's geographical boundaries. The burning of the manuscripts ensured that these ideas did not survive to challenge future theological or social structures. Collectively, these four strands illustrate the breadth of spiritual expression that flourished on the margins of medieval Christianity and the varied ways in which ecclesiastical authorities responded. While none of these movements achieved the scale of major heresies, their existence reveals that Christian spirituality was not confined to institutional channels. Radical interpretations of purity, extreme asceticism, esoteric communal life, and apocalyptic vision could all emerge in localized contexts, shaped by cultural, social, and individual influences. The Church's suppression of these groups reflects a complex assessment of danger, not solely doctrinal deviance, but the potential for disruptive practices to gain traction among vulnerable populations. This dynamic also highlights the interplay between written and unwritten forms of belief. Movements with limited textual output often left only ephemeral traces in official records, yet these traces were sufficient to prompt intervention. The suppression of such groups seldom involved grand theological refutations, because their beliefs were not systematized enough to require them. Instead, ecclesiastical action focused on preventing these practices from spreading or becoming institutionalized. The disappearance of their teachings from historical memory is therefore the result of both limited documentation and deliberate efforts to extinguish influences considered destabilizing. The broader implications for historians are significant. The fragmentary evidence for these groups suggests a wider range of medieval Christianities than commonly recognized. Spiritual experimentation occurred not only in monastic settings or among learned theologians, but also within small lay communities searching for more intense or more immediate forms of divine encounter. The suppression of these groups reveals the Church's determination to maintain a coherent framework for Christian identity, one that could accommodate ascetic devotion but not radical departures from established practice. Their disappearance underscores the extent to which institutional decisions shaped the contours of what would later be remembered as orthodox spirituality. These suppressed micro-movements form a bridge between the world of forbidden intellectual inquiry and the realm of feared manuscripts that circulated at the edges of acceptable devotion. When movements lacked extensive writings, the Church confronted them directly. When manuscripts carried dangerous ideas independently of communities, a different kind of response emerged, one centered on restricting, sequestering, or destroying texts that seemed imbued with an aura of spiritual threat. The transition from obscure Christian cults to the phenomenon of cursed manuscripts marks the next chapter in this evolving pattern, where the perceived danger shifts from human communities to the written word itself, and where manuscripts are treated not merely as texts, but as objects capable of transmitting spiritual peril. Historians examining the trajectory of medieval and early modern manuscript culture often remark that certain texts acquired reputations that blurred the line between theological danger and supernatural fear. Unlike philosophical treatises or doctrinal challenges, these manuscripts evoked unease, not merely because of their content, but because of the aura surrounding them, an atmosphere shaped by rumor, misattribution, or inexplicable events recorded in monastic accounts. In ecclesiastical contexts where the written word held extraordinary spiritual authority, manuscripts considered spiritually hazardous could become objects of caution, confinement, and sometimes destruction. The resulting category of cursed manuscripts emerges not from official doctrine, but from the interplay of fear, interpretation, and the power attributed to texts capable of shaping imagination or disturbing communal equilibrium. One example frequently discussed by specialists in manuscript history is the so-called Black Psalter, a volume whose reputation derived from both its misattributed authorship and the circumstances of its circulation. The book, adorned in darkly pigmented materials and associated incorrectly with a controversial figure, attracted suspicion among monastic readers. Its unusual script and ornamentation, combined with speculation about its origins, led some ecclesiastical authorities to confine it to restricted collections. The text itself contained nothing explicitly heretical. Its danger lay in the narratives that developed around it. Over time, clerics treated the manuscript as a potential source of confusion, concerned that its misattribution could influence interpretations of the Psalms or lend credibility to teachings considered erroneous. The decision to lock it away illustrates how the Church sometimes acted not on doctrinal fault, but on the cultural power of rumor and symbolic association. A different type of unease arose from a prayer book linked by contemporaries to a period of unexplained illness within a monastic community. Surviving marginal notes indicate that several monks fell sick shortly after the text entered circulation, prompting speculation about divine displeasure or spiritual contamination. Although modern historians interpret these accounts within the broader context of medieval understandings of disease, the associations were strong enough for ecclesiastical authorities to remove the manuscript from liturgical use. Chroniclers describe the object being placed in isolation, not because of theological error, but because of the conviction that its presence carried an undefined spiritual threat. This episode reflects a worldview in which manuscripts were not passive carriers of words, but potential agents of influence, whose effects extended beyond intellectual engagement. Whether the illnesses were coincidental or misinterpreted, the resulting fear shaped how the manuscript was treated and illustrates how spiritual caution could override textual analysis. Instances also exist in which scribes themselves hesitated to reproduce certain manuscripts, either because of controversial content or because the texts carried reputations of misfortune. Scholars studying scriptoria note occasions when copyists annotated margins with warnings or expressed reluctance to replicate a work. In some cases, This resistance arose from fear that the text's ideas, often linked to speculative theology or extreme asceticism, might invite accusations of heresy. In others, the reluctance reflected beliefs that the manuscript had brought hardship to previous custodians. This type of self-censorship demonstrates how the aura surrounding a text could inhibit its reproduction even without formal prohibition. The combination of rumor, fear, and responsibility shaped the choices of scribes who served as gatekeepers of textual transmission and whose decisions significantly influenced which writings survived and which faded into obscurity. Another layer of restricted circulation appears in notes related to exorcistic formulas preserved under seal. These documents, intended for trained clergy, contained precise invocations, ritual procedures, and descriptions of spiritual confrontations. Ecclesiastical authorities recognized that uncontrolled access to such material could lead to misuse or encourage practices outside official liturgical norms. As a result, certain manuscripts were stored in locked collections, accessible only to clerics authorized to perform exorcisms. The texts themselves were not condemned. Their danger stemmed from the possibility that untrained individuals could apply the instructions incorrectly or exploit them for unauthorized spiritual experimentation. The careful confinement of these manuscripts indicates a concern that sacred rituals required controlled transmission to maintain doctrinal and pastoral integrity. Their restricted status reflects a broader pattern in which the Church sought to regulate the intersection of spiritual power and written knowledge. The fifth dimension of this phenomenon involves reports of a codex implicated in a series of unexplained deaths. References to the manuscript appear in later chronicles, describing a sequence of events in which custodians died under circumstances that contemporaries considered suspicious. The manuscript's contents remain uncertain, and modern historians debate whether the association between the codex and the deaths reflects actual historical correlation or a narrative shaped by fear and coincidence. Regardless of its origin, the reputation proved powerful enough that the codex was ultimately removed from circulation, and its later fate remains unknown. The disappearance of the manuscript encapsulates the intersection of superstition, caution, and institutional desire to prevent the spread of stories that might foster fear or undermine confidence in the Church's stewardship of sacred texts. Taken together, these 5 strands reveal how manuscripts could become objects of concern, not only because of their content, but because of the meanings communities projected onto them. The Church, responsible for managing both theological correctness and spiritual well-being, responded to these concerns by restricting access, isolating problematic volumes, or permitting their disappearance. This approach reflects a nuanced understanding of textual danger. A manuscript could be destabilizing even without explicit heresy. It could influence belief, fuel rumor, or unsettle communal life simply through its associations. Ecclesiastical authorities recognized the symbolic power of the written word in societies where literacy was limited and texts carried significant spiritual weight. Their decisions regarding cursed manuscripts therefore operated at the intersection of doctrine, culture, and pastoral care. The phenomenon also underscores the vulnerability of manuscript transmission. Texts that elicited fear or suspicion were less likely to be copied and more likely to vanish. Their disappearance shapes the modern historical record, leaving behind only hints of what once existed. Scholars attempting to reconstruct these manuscripts rely on scattered references, marginal notes, or brief mentions in catalogues. The resulting picture is necessarily incomplete, shaped as much by what survived as by what did not. The absence of these texts complicates efforts to understand the full spectrum of medieval spirituality and highlights the extent to which fear and caution influenced the survival of written culture. This atmosphere of controlled circulation and selective preservation prepares the ground for a more structured form of censorship that emerged in later centuries, the index of forbidden books. Whereas cursed manuscripts reflect localized fears and contextual responses, the index represents a systematic effort to regulate reading across the broader Christian world. Its condemnations, restrictions, and special warnings constitute the next stage in the evolution of ecclesiastical control over knowledge. The transition from folkloric dread to administrative prohibition marks a shift in strategy, from reacting to perceived spiritual threats to defining a formal framework for managing intellectual risk. In the next chapter, this development becomes clearer through the examination of works that the Index considered so dangerous that they warranted not only condemnation but specialized internal warnings aimed at preventing their misuse even among educated clergy. Historians analyzing the machinery of censorship in the early modern church often describe the Index of Forbidden Books as both a doctrinal instrument and a psychological one, designed not merely to prohibit but to shape the mental landscape within which Christians encountered ideas. When the Index is reduced to a catalogue of titles, its deeper significance is lost. The institution behind it operated with remarkable nuance. Some works were banned outright, others restricted by category, and a subset, less widely discussed, was accompanied by internal commentaries offering special warnings to ecclesiastical readers. These layers reveal that the Church recognized multiple forms of danger in texts: political volatility, theological deviation, spiritual confusion, and the potential for ideas to influence behavior unpredictably. Through this apparatus, the Index functioned as both an archive of anxiety and a map of intellectual boundaries. Among the works that received exceptional scrutiny were politically subversive treatises whose arguments intersected uneasily with theological principles. These texts, often framed as critiques of governance or proposals for social reform, blurred the line between political philosophy and doctrinal interpretation. Some argued for radical reconfigurations of authority, invoking scriptural justification in ways that threatened to reshape both ecclesiastical and civil hierarchies. Ecclesiastical censors understood that such writings could galvanize opposition or fuel unrest, especially in territories where tensions between church and state simmered beneath the surface. Their inclusion in the Index reflected not only theological concern, but a recognition that ideas wielded political power. Scholars examining the annotations accompanying these condemnations note that the language often emphasizes the potential for disturbance, a term that hints at both civic disorder and spiritual agitation. The Church's response illustrates an awareness that political speculation could become a catalyst for dissent within religious communities. A similar mixture of pastoral and doctrinal concern appears in the treatment of vernacular Bibles associated with rebellion. While vernacular scripture eventually became accepted within Catholic practice, earlier instances of unauthorized translations, particularly those linked to movements challenging ecclesiastical authority, were met with severe restriction. The concern centered on the possibility that untrained readers might misinterpret complex passages or adopt interpretations promoted by dissident leaders. Some translations circulated alongside commentaries that subtly or overtly contradicted church teaching. By prohibiting these versions, the Index aimed to prevent the spread of interpretations that might fracture communal unity or inspire alternative structures of authority. Scholars who study these early prohibitions often highlight that the danger lay not in the vernacular itself, but in the combination of translation, commentary, and context. The Index thus reflects an effort to preserve the interpretive coherence of Scripture in a period of religious volatility. Another category of restricted works included mystical literature that, while not explicitly heretical, contained speculative theology considered unsafe for general readers. Mystical writings often explored themes of divine union, interior illumination, and spiritual detachment in language that could easily be misread. Some texts encouraged a form of spiritual autonomy that bypassed ecclesiastical guidance. Others contained ambiguous symbols or metaphors that risked being interpreted as endorsements of unregulated revelation. Ecclesiastical censors approached these works with caution, recognizing their potential to inspire profound devotion, but also their capacity to lead readers toward interpretations that blurred doctrinal boundaries. The Index therefore applied selective restrictions, Some mystical texts were permitted only with annotations, others were approved for trained clergy but not the laity, and a few were banned outright. These distinctions reflect an attempt to preserve the richness of mystical tradition while safeguarding against spiritual misdirection. A final dimension of this regulatory system involves the destruction of translations deemed spiritually dangerous. These were not always grand works of theology. Some were paraphrases, adaptations, or simplified renditions of complex texts. The concern was that translators, intentionally or not, introduced distortions that could alter the meaning of central doctrines. In some cases, the translated versions circulated among communities, unable to read the original language, making the mistranslation more influential than the source. Ecclesiastical authorities, upon identifying such distortions, ordered the elimination of the offending versions. The destruction of these translations underscores a recurring theme: the Church's vigilance toward the transformative power of words, especially when disseminated among readers without access to corrective frameworks. This vigilance sought to prevent doctrinal error from entering communal life under the guise of accessibility. Together, these four strands illuminate the multifaceted nature of the index. It served as an intellectual filter, shaping the conditions under which Catholics encountered ideas by categorizing texts, not solely in terms of orthodoxy, but in terms of potential impact. The index emerged as an institution built on discernment, recognizing different grades of danger and responding with tailored measures. Its function was not limited to suppression. It also reflected a pedagogy of reading, an attempt to guide the faithful toward what ecclesiastical authorities understood as the safe pursuit of truth. The long-term effects of these measures remained visible in the development of Catholic intellectual culture. By restricting or shaping access to certain works, the index influenced which conversations flourished and which remained dormant. Some ideas, suppressed in one era, resurfaced in later theological reflection. Others disappeared entirely. The selective preservation and destruction of translations affected how scripture and tradition were understood across linguistic boundaries. Mystical writings, filtered through the index, continue to shape spiritual practice in ways that reflect the balance between freedom and caution embedded within these decisions. At the same time, the existence of special warnings and internal notes reveals that the Church recognized the subtleties of intellectual danger. Not all threats were overt. Some lay in tone, implication, or potential misapplication. The index functioned as a protective system aimed at preventing vulnerabilities from becoming fractures. Its careful structuring demonstrates an awareness that ideas could influence behavior, devotion, and communal life in complex ways. This awareness shaped an institutional memory that extended far beyond the index itself. This evolution in the Church's engagement with texts leads naturally to the next dimension of suppressed knowledge, mysteries tied not to books or intellectual inquiry, but to the decisions of popes, whose actions sometimes left behind gaps, contradictions, or ambiguities in the historical record. As the index formalized the management of dangerous writings, papal decisions revealed the pressures and uncertainties that guided ecclesiastical governance. These moments, preserved in fragments or hinted at through missing documentation, form the foundation of the next chapter, where the mysteries surrounding popes illuminate another facet of suppressed or obscured history. Historians examining the administrative history of the papacy often remark that the Vatican's archives record not only the stability of ecclesiastical governance, but also moments of discontinuity, hesitation, and contradiction. These moments emerge in marginal notes, abrupt changes in policy, gaps in official registers, and documents that appear once and are never referenced again. The study of papal mysteries is therefore less an investigation of dramatic events than of subtle irregularities, decisions that shifted course without explanation, writings that were retracted after circulation, or records that entered the archive only to vanish later. Each instance reveals how the pressures of doctrine, diplomacy, and internal politics occasionally collided, leaving behind a documentary landscape shaped as much by omission as by preservation. One such case involves the sudden retraction of a papal bull. whose content has been partially reconstructed through indirect citations. The bull reportedly addressed a theological issue that had generated debate within certain clerical circles. Its initial promulgation signaled a clear stance from the highest authority, yet within a short period the document was withdrawn, and subsequent references portray the matter as unresolved. Scholars analysing this reversal note that such retractions were rare and typically occurred when new information, political considerations, or internal disagreements rendered the original judgment untenable. The absence of an official explanation suggests that the retraction served to prevent further controversy rather than to revise doctrine publicly. The discontinuity invites speculation about the forces that compelled such an abrupt shift, forces that remain hidden behind the silence of the surviving record. A different type of mystery emerges from the loss of papal diary pages, believed to contain reflections on doctrinal disputes. Personal writings of popes vary widely in form and preservation, but in certain periods, diaries served as spaces for private contemplation about theological developments, relationships with influential figures, or responses to political pressures. The missing pages, referenced in later compilations, yet absent from the archive, hint at deliberations that may have shaped significant decisions. Historians debate whether the pages were removed intentionally or lost through ordinary archival challenges. Some suggest that their disappearance correlates with periods of heightened controversy, implying that their content touched on matters considered sensitive after the fact. Others argue that the loss reflects the fragility of private documents within a broader institutional system. Whatever the cause, the absence of these reflections obscures an important dimension of papal thought, leaving gaps that complicate the reconstruction of historical motives. Another instance involves a pope who secretly denounced certain scientific advisors, whose interpretations of natural philosophy conflicted with emerging doctrinal priorities. While the Church often engaged constructively with scientific inquiry, tensions arose when new theories challenged established cosmological or anthropological frameworks. Surviving administrative notes reveal that the Pope expressed deep concern about the potential influence of specific advisors, fearing that their ideas might spread unchecked within clerical or academic circles. The resulting denunciation, circulated privately, halted the group's collaboration with ecclesiastical institutions. The secrecy surrounding the action indicates a desire to prevent scandal or public debate, while ensuring that certain interpretations did not gain authoritative traction. This episode illustrates the delicate balance the papacy maintained between fostering intellectual advancement and safeguarding doctrinal boundaries. Papal succession records provide another glimpse into the complexities of governance. In one period, documentation reveals contradictions in the sequence of events surrounding the election of a new pontiff. Chronicles from different regions report conflicting dates and procedures, while internal registers offer incomplete accounts. Some historians attribute the discrepancies to communication delays or regional variation in record keeping. Others see the contradictions as indicative of political tension, suggesting that factions within the Church may have contested aspects of the transition. The inconsistencies have led to debates about whether certain steps were omitted intentionally from the official narrative to present a more orderly picture of succession. The lack of clarifying documents allows multiple interpretations to coexist, each pointing toward the broader challenge of reconstructing events when the surviving record is shaped by both documentation and its intentional limits. Even more puzzling is the reference to a consistory that appears in two independent sources but is absent from official papal registers. The consistory, reportedly convened to address a theological question, left no surviving documentation beyond these scattered mentions. Scholars disagree about whether the meeting took place at all, with some arguing that the references indicate an event that was later deemed too sensitive to preserve, while others suggest that the citations may reflect misunderstandings or misreporting by contemporaries. The ambiguity surrounding the consistory exemplifies how historical visibility depends not only on the occurrence of events, but also on the choices made about their preservation. If the meeting occurred and was intentionally omitted from the record, the omission underscores a conscious attempt to control future interpretations. If the references are inaccurate, their persistence demonstrates how easily the historical imagination can be shaped by scant evidence. Taken together, these 5 strands illustrate the complex interplay between papal authority and historical memory. The papacy, as an institution, relied on documentation to project continuity, stability, and doctrinal clarity, yet the pressures of governance inevitably produced moments where complete transparency was neither possible nor desirable. Retractions, missing reflections, secret denunciations, contradictory succession accounts, and unrecorded meetings reveal the subtle ways in which the papacy navigated conflict, uncertainty, and risk. These irregularities do not suggest a monolithic strategy of suppression, but rather a constellation of responses shaped by circumstance. The resulting gaps in the archive function as reminders that even the most documented institution in Christian history faced limitations on what could be preserved or revealed. For historians, these absences highlight the importance of reading the Vatican archive, not merely for what it contains, but for what it omits. The silence surrounding certain decisions may reflect political prudence, pastoral caution, or the desire to prevent theological confusion. At the same time, these omissions complicate efforts to reconstruct papal motivations. The historian must interpret incomplete evidence, cross-reference indirect citations, and consider the institutional dynamics that shaped the documentary landscape. Each papal mystery becomes a point of entry into the broader question of how authority, memory, and documentation intersect in the governance of the Church. This recognition leads naturally into the next area of investigation, where the focus shifts from papal decisions to monastic environments that preserved or concealed knowledge considered too dangerous for broader circulation. Within monastic communities, manuscripts could be hidden, scholars could disappear from the record, and controversial ideas could be transmitted in subtle ways that defied ecclesiastical surveillance. The next chapter explores this monastic shadow world, where the boundaries between preservation and suppression blur in ways that continue to intrigue historians. Historians studying the inner life of medieval monasticism often emphasize that monasteries, while centers of spiritual discipline and intellectual preservation, also operated as complex worlds of internal debate, cautious secrecy, and selective transmission. These communities, entrusted with copying manuscripts, teaching novices, and safeguarding theological continuity, held considerable influence over what knowledge survived across generations. Yet their archives and traditions contain signs of tension, disagreements about doctrine, disagreements about governance, and disagreements about the handling of texts that carried implications beyond local boundaries. Within this environment, a monastic shadow world emerges, not one defined by overt rebellion, but by the quiet negotiation of spiritual authority and intellectual responsibility. One significant thread in this environment concerns monasteries accused of hiding forbidden books. Accounts survive of ecclesiastical visitors discovering volumes that had been removed from official catalogues and stored apart from the main collection. These texts often belong to authors whose reputations were contested or whose writings raised theological questions that the broader Church preferred to regulate. Some manuscripts contained speculative theology, others offered alternate commentaries on Scripture, and still others represented versions of historical narratives at odds with accepted chronology. Historians examining visitation reports note that monastic custodians rarely admitted wrongdoing. Instead, they sometimes defended their preservation efforts as matters of scholarly integrity or spiritual heritage. This dynamic illustrates how the desire to safeguard intellectual diversity coexisted uneasily with the obligation to maintain doctrinal conformity. Monasteries, functioning as repositories of memory, occasionally preserved works deemed unacceptable elsewhere, creating pockets of alternative knowledge that existed below the surface of ecclesiastical oversight. A second dimension of this shadow world appears in the disappearance of monastic scholars whose writings or influence became controversial. Some monks produced commentaries or treatises that questioned prevailing interpretations of scripture or natural philosophy. When their ideas attracted criticism, references to their work sometimes diminished abruptly, and their names receded from institutional memory. Surviving fragments, letters, marginal annotations, or indirect citations suggest that their intellectual contributions were more substantial than the surviving record indicates. Historians investigating these disappearances propose several explanations. Authorities may have discouraged further copying of their manuscripts, monastic leadership may have suppressed internal debates, or later generations may have chosen to omit figures associated with contested ideas. The resulting silences reveal how monastic history can be shaped as much by selective forgetting as by active preservation. A related phenomenon emerges from the existence of a lost monastic treatise on cosmology, referenced in commentaries but absent from surviving collections. The treaty reportedly offered a synthesis of theological and astronomical insights, reflecting a moment when monastic scholars engaged deeply with natural philosophy. The absence of the original manuscript complicates efforts to understand its content, but the descriptions suggest that it proposed interpretations of celestial order that some contemporaries considered too speculative. While no direct evidence indicates intentional destruction, the lack of preservation may reflect institutional caution toward cosmological ideas that risked unsettling established doctrine. The disappearance underscores the vulnerability of intellectual projects that straddled the boundary between devotion and inquiry, particularly in environments where orthodoxy required careful navigation. Another aspect of monastic suppression involves testimonies describing monks providing refuge to individuals accused of heresy. Chronicles and legal records occasionally mention cases in which monastic communities sheltered dissenters, offering protection or anonymity. The motivations behind such actions varied: compassion for individuals under threat, sympathy for certain theological perspectives, or resistance to external pressures. Ecclesiastical authorities viewed these actions as problematic, associating them with undermining judicial processes or enabling the spread of unorthodox ideas. Some monasteries faced investigation or sanction for their involvement. The episodes reveal how monastic values, hospitality, spiritual independence, and loyalty to community could place them at odds with broader ecclesiastical structures, creating an undercurrent of tension between pastoral charity and institutional enforcement. The final strand of this shadow world concerns manuscripts smuggled from suppressed abbeys. When certain monastic institutions were dissolved due to political conflicts, doctrinal disputes, or administrative reforms, their libraries faced dispersal. Evidence suggests that monks or sympathizers sometimes removed texts before official confiscation, transporting them to other monasteries or private collections. These smuggled manuscripts often included works considered sensitive, theological treatises, subject to censorship, historical narratives, challenging official chronologies, or mystical texts valued for their spiritual depth, but viewed with suspicion by authorities. The redistribution of these materials created informal networks of preservation, ensuring the survival of writings that might otherwise have been lost. Historians tracing these networks observe that they contributed to the uneven transmission of knowledge, with certain texts resurfacing centuries later in unexpected locations. Together, these 5 strands portray monasticism not as a uniform institution, but as a mosaic of individual communities, navigating the challenges of intellectual stewardship. Monastic libraries and scriptoria functioned as both protectors and regulators of knowledge, preserving texts that enriched spiritual life while responding to hierarchical expectations. The tensions embedded in this dual role fostered environments where marginal ideas could survive, not through open defiance, but through subtle choices, retaining certain manuscripts, allowing others to fade, offering shelter, or quietly relocating contested works. This dynamic significantly shaped the historical record. Many texts survive today only because a monastic scribe chose to copy them despite controversies, while others disappeared because preservation was deemed too risky. The uneven transmission of knowledge reflects the complex interplay between institutional control and monastic autonomy. Scholars studying these processes emphasize that monasteries acted as crucial mediators between official doctrine and the wider world of Christian thought. Their decisions, influenced by theological conviction, practical concerns, and the immediate needs of the community, left lasting imprints on the intellectual landscape of the Church. These revelations about monastic secrecy and selective preservation naturally lead to the next chapter, where suppressed voices emerge not from institutions, but from individuals whose spiritual insights diverged from accepted patterns. While monasteries navigated tensions internally, other figures, especially women, produced writings that challenged established categories of theology, devotion, and authority. Their texts, often preserved only in fragments or partially censored, illuminate another dimension of hidden knowledge within Christian history. The transition from monastic shadow worlds to the stories of hidden female voices marks a shift from institutional negotiation to the suppression of personal revelation, offering a different perspective on how the Church balanced spiritual creativity with doctrinal boundaries. Historians examining the literary legacy of medieval and early modern Christian women often note a striking imbalance between the volume of material known to have been produced and the amount that survives. The disparity cannot be explained solely through the fragility of manuscripts or the uneven education of women. It reflects a deeper pattern of selective transmission shaped by ecclesiastical caution, social constraints, and the discomfort caused by voices that articulated spiritual experiences in terms not easily absorbed into established theological frameworks. Female mystics, visionaries, and scholars sometimes offered interpretations of divine encounter that challenged inherited categories, blurring the boundaries between orthodoxy and innovation. Their writings, shaped by intense devotion and acute theological insight, carried the potential to inspire transformation within religious communities, and it was precisely this potential that made them both powerful and vulnerable. One significant example concerns manuscripts produced by persecuted women whose writings were closely monitored by ecclesiastical authorities. In several recorded cases, women who articulated visionary experiences or theological reflections in their own words attracted suspicion not because their ideas were explicitly heretical, but because their authority derived from personal revelation. When these texts circulated among lay readers or attracted small circles of followers, ecclesiastical officials intervened to restrict access or halt copying. In some instances, surviving documents attest to the confiscation of manuscripts during investigations, with only portions preserved in inquisitorial summaries or notes by clerical examiners. These fragments reveal voices grappling with themes of divine intimacy, moral transformation, and eschatological expectation. The partial nature of their survival reflects an environment where women's theological agency was tolerated only so long as it remained clearly subordinate to institutional authority. A different form of suppression emerges in writings produced by women whose prophetic claims challenged local power structures. Some of these figures, drawing on biblical language and visionary symbolism, articulated critiques of corruption or moral decline within ecclesiastical or civic institutions. Their messages, often circulated in the form of letters or recorded testimonies, provoked alarm among authorities concerned about the destabilizing potential of charismatic prophecy. Surviving records describe efforts to restrain these voices through pastoral correction, confinement, or formal censure. When their writings proved influential, ecclesiastical officials sometimes ordered them removed from circulation. The suppression of these texts reveals how prophetic authority exercised by women complicated traditional hierarchies, generating tensions that shaped the preservation or disappearance of their work. The actions taken against them show that spiritual boldness, when expressed outside approved channels, could be interpreted as a threat to communal order. A more obscure but equally revealing example involves handwritten booklets produced by women associated with informal devotional circles. These circles often formed within households, charitable communities, or lay confraternities, where women exchanged reflections on scripture, meditations on the Passion, or accounts of answered prayers. While many such writings aligned with accepted devotional literature, some incorporated highly personal interpretations or unconventional imagery. Ecclesiastical visitors sometimes encountered these booklets during routine inspections and expressed concern about their potential to promote unauthorized teachings. In certain cases, the texts were seized, corrected, or quietly removed. Their disappearance from local archives suggests that authorities viewed them as spiritually earnest but theologically unregulated, capable of generating interpretations that diverged from established doctrine. The limited survival of these writings highlights the vulnerability of devotional creativity in environments where official oversight strongly influenced textual preservation. Another strand of hidden female authorship appears in the existence of incomplete personal chronicles, manuscripts that begin with detailed accounts of spiritual experience but break off abruptly. These interruptions occur without explanation, leaving historians to speculate whether the authors chose to discontinue writing, whether circumstances prevented completion, or whether external intervention halted the work. Some of these chronicles reveal sophisticated theological engagement, weaving together biblical exegesis, liturgical reflection, and personal insight. Their sudden endings suggest that the freedom to articulate such reflections could be precarious. The absence of concluding sections may reflect concerns expressed by confessors, pressures from community leaders, or broader ecclesiastical caution regarding women who demonstrated intellectual autonomy. The partial survival of these texts underscores the fragility of female authorship in a tradition where spiritual authority was often mediated through male clerical structures. Together, these four strands portray a landscape in which women's voices played a vital yet contested role in the development of Christian thought. Their writings demonstrate theological depth, spiritual creativity, and remarkable resilience in the face of institutional pressures. At the same time, the uneven preservation of their work reveals the social and ecclesiastical constraints that shaped what could be transmitted across generations. Female authors who articulated spiritual insight in forms too independent, too prophetic, or too unconventional often found their writings censored, restricted, or left incomplete. The history of these suppressed voices therefore mirrors broader patterns within Christian intellectual tradition, where innovation and authority were in constant negotiation. The consequences of these dynamics extend beyond the individuals involved. When manuscripts were confiscated, corrected, or destroyed, the broader Christian tradition lost access to perspectives that might have enriched theological understanding. The surviving fragments hint at a diversity of spiritual expression that challenges simplified narratives of medieval and early modern piety. They reveal women engaging with scripture, doctrine, and mystical experience in ways that complemented monastic scholarship and clerical theology, even when their contributions struggle to find institutional acceptance. The selective survival of their work has shaped modern perceptions of Christian spirituality, obscuring the full range of female intellectual agency. The silence surrounding many of these authors also highlights the mechanisms through which history is shaped by omission. The disappearance of manuscripts, the truncation of chronicles, and the absence of complete archives reflect decisions made by individuals and institutions navigating complex spiritual and political pressures. These decisions, whether motivated by caution, fear, the study of hidden female authors, therefore demands a methodology attentive to gaps, hints, and indirect evidence. Historians must reconstruct these voices through careful analysis of citations, visitation reports, and surviving fragments that escaped suppression. This exploration of suppressed female authorship naturally transitions to the next chapter, where the focus shifts from the realm of personal manuscripts to the broader question of theological ideas that the Church deemed too dangerous for public dissemination. If the voices of individual women could provoke unease through their originality, certain concepts developed within theological, philosophical, or mystical traditions posed challenges at a structural level. The movement from hidden authors to forbidden concepts thus marks a shift from personal suppression to the regulation of ideas that risked reshaping the foundational categories of Christian thought. Historians examining the development of Christian doctrine routinely note that alongside the well-known controversies that shaped conciliar definitions, there existed a parallel set of theological ideas that circulated briefly, attracted cautious interest, and were ultimately withheld from broader dissemination. These ideas rarely crystallized into organized heresies. Instead, they emerged within scholarly circles, monastic debates, or private correspondence, provoking concern less through outright contradiction than through implications that unsettled foundational categories. Their fate reveals a pattern in which the Church engaged deeply with speculative thought, while simultaneously limiting the spread of concepts judged too destabilizing for general teaching. The trajectory of these forbidden concepts offers a window into the intellectual thresholds that delineated the boundaries of acceptable inquiry. One example appears in early discussions concerning universal salvation. A number of theologians explored interpretations of divine mercy that suggested the eventual reconciliation of all souls with God, drawing on scriptural passages emphasizing the universality of redemption. These reflections, though not presented as formal doctrine, generated concern among ecclesiastical authorities worried about their potential influence on moral behavior and sacramental discipline. The speculation implied a transformative hope that exceeded established eschatological frameworks. While the Church affirmed God's limitless love, it rejected interpretations that undermined teachings on judgment, repentance, and the consequences of sin. The sensitive nature of the topic led to restrictions on how these ideas were circulated. Some manuscripts were corrected, others were withheld from public reading, and a few were stored in monastic libraries under limited access. Their partial suppression reflects a recognition that eschatological optimism, if detached from moral accountability, could distort pastoral teaching. A second trajectory of concern involved early medieval formulations that approached pantheism. Certain thinkers, influenced by Neoplatonic traditions, articulated descriptions of divine immanence, so expansive that they blurred distinctions between creator and creation. Their language, often poetic or contemplative, aimed to express the intimacy between God and the world. Yet their formulations risked suggesting that all beings were merely manifestations of the divine essence. Ecclesiastical authorities, attentive to the need to preserve the distinction between God and creation, responded cautiously. Some writings were subjected to doctrinal correction, while others were quietly discouraged from further circulation. The challenge lay in distinguishing legitimate mystical insight from philosophical expression that moved too close to collapsing metaphysical distinctions essential to Christian theology. The resulting limitations illustrate how the Church sought to channel speculative thought without allowing metaphysical ambiguity to reshape doctrine. Another domain of suppressed speculation involved theories proposing multiple Earths or cosmological worlds. Medieval scholars, drawing on classical sources and imaginative interpretation, occasionally entertained the possibility of realms beyond the known cosmos. These ideas, while rarely developed into systematic theories, introduced questions about the nature of creation, the scope of divine providence, and the uniqueness of human salvation. Ecclesiastical readers viewed such speculation with caution, concerned that it could lead to theological puzzles regarding the incarnation, original sin, and the universality of redemption. References to these theories appear sporadically in commentaries, often accompanied by notes urging discretion or skepticism. The absence of extensive debate reflects not a lack of curiosity, but the recognition that the implications of such ideas extended beyond the boundaries of established doctrine. The concepts were therefore tolerated as hypothetical speculation, but discouraged from wider discourse. A fourth cluster of restricted ideas appears in mystical thought that interpreted prophetic visions as foretelling an imminent transformation of the Church itself. Some mystics, interpreting symbols drawn from apocalyptic texts, suggested that future epochs would bring structural or spiritual changes to ecclesiastical authority. Their visions sometimes implied shifts in hierarchy or predicted new forms of governance. Ecclesiastical authorities, aware of the potential for such interpretations to fuel movements of reform or dissent, approached these ideas with caution. While genuine mysticism was valued, predictions implying institutional disruption were treated as potentially harmful. Records indicate that some visionaries received guidance limiting their public expression, and writings containing strong apocalyptic imagery were either corrected or withheld. The moderation imposed on these texts demonstrates the need to maintain stability at moments when eschatological expectations could be interpreted as calls for radical change. A final strand of forbidden conceptual exploration appears in intellectual circles that speculated about the limits of demonic influence. Some theologians proposed models that extended the scope of demonic activity into realms previously attributed solely to human or natural causes. Their theories suggested interactions between spiritual and physical worlds that complicated prevailing categories of moral agency, temptation, and divine protection. While this line of thought aimed to clarify the relationship between spiritual warfare and daily life, it also risked fostering interpretations that exaggerated demonic power or undermined human responsibility. Ecclesiastical responses included warnings against speculative demonology and limitations on the circulation of texts that advanced such ideas. The goal was not to deny spiritual reality, but to prevent imaginative theories from overshadowing doctrinal balance. Together, these 5 strands illustrate how theological inquiry moved along a spectrum that required constant negotiation between intellectual curiosity and doctrinal clarity. The Church, recognizing the importance of exploring profound questions, allowed room for speculation while remaining attentive to potential distortions. Suppression in this context did not originate from hostility toward inquiry, but from the responsibility to safeguard the coherence of belief. Ideas that challenged central categories, salvation, creation, ecclesiology, and spiritual agency, were monitored carefully, encouraged in certain forms, and restrained when their implications exceeded acceptable boundaries. The consequences of these decisions shaped the trajectory of Christian theology. Some suppressed ideas resurfaced centuries later in new contexts, enriched by developments in philosophy, science, or spirituality. Others disappeared almost entirely, preserved only in marginal notes or indirect citations. The absence of sustained debate in certain areas reflects not a lack of interest, but the influence of institutional caution that limited how far particular concepts could evolve. This selective shaping of the intellectual landscape ensured that doctrinal teaching remained unified, even as scholars pursued profound and complex questions. For historians, the study of these forbidden concepts highlights the challenge of reconstructing intellectual movements that left minimal direct evidence. The suppression of speculative ideas often occurred not through public condemnation, but through the quieter mechanisms of limited circulation, editorial intervention, or pastoral restraint. As a result, the historical record offers glimpses rather than comprehensive accounts. The reconstruction of these ideas requires attention to hints preserved in commentaries, corrected manuscripts, and theological debates, where the shadow of excluded concepts is sometimes more visible than their explicit articulation. This exploration of dangerous ideas leads naturally to the next chapter, where attention shifts from speculative theology to the physical spaces that concealed clandestine materials. If forbidden concepts were managed through careful regulation of intellectual boundaries, hidden rooms within ecclesiastical structures reveal another form of control, the physical sequestering of texts deemed too contentious or too valuable to expose. The movement from suppressed ideas to secret archives marks the next stage in the broader pattern of managing knowledge that carried implications the Church was not prepared to confront publicly. Historians investigating the physical infrastructure of ecclesiastical archives increasingly emphasize that control over knowledge was exercised not only through doctrinal judgments and editorial interventions, but also through the architecture of secrecy. Buildings that housed monastic libraries, cathedral treasuries, and episcopal chanceries often contained spaces whose purposes were not fully explained in surviving records. Sealed chambers, inaccessible storerooms, or alcoves bricked over during renovations. These spaces, difficult to interpret without context, indicate that certain materials were preserved in ways aimed at restricting access or shielding them from public scrutiny. The resulting topography of hidden rooms suggests a deliberate strategy whereby physical separation served as a complement to intellectual regulation, enabling the Church to manage materials that carried political, theological, or spiritual sensitivities. One example frequently discussed in architectural studies concerns a sealed chamber discovered during a refurbishment of an early modern ecclesiastical building. The room contained no furnishings and only a few scattered remains of parchment fragments. Yet its construction indicated intentional concealment. The doorway had been walled off with carefully matched masonry, and the chamber lacked any external markings. Researchers examining the site proposed that the room may have served as a temporary holding space for documents removed from circulation, materials judged too sensitive to destroy, yet too dangerous to leave accessible. The absence of identifiable manuscripts prevents definitive conclusions, but the architectural intent is clear. The space was designed to exist without being noticed. Such chambers illustrate how silence could be physically constructed, forming part of a wider effort to manage knowledge through spatial restriction. A different form of architectural secrecy appears in references to a private clerical archive, used by a small circle of high-ranking ecclesiastical officials. Surviving administrative notes describe a storage area distinct from the main chancery collections, reserved for documents requiring confidential handling. Access to this archive was limited, and inventories were not incorporated into official registries. Historians suggest that the archive may have contained correspondence related to delicate negotiations, contested doctrinal issues, or unresolved accusations. Its separation from the main archive ensured that materials stored there did not enter routine circulation or become available to scholars in later centuries. The existence of such private repositories underscores how structural hierarchies influenced the preservation of knowledge, allowing certain individuals to dictate which documents would remain visible and which would be hidden from future interpretation. Another intriguing case arises from the discovery of an alcove designed to store texts considered spiritually dangerous. Architectural features indicate that the alcove, located within a monastic library, included a locking mechanism accessible only to selected officials. The design resembles storage practices seen in collections of liturgical vessels or relics, suggesting that the manuscripts kept there were treated not only as intellectual artifacts, but as objects requiring ritual caution. While the specific texts associated with the alcove remain unknown, contemporaneous accounts describe similar spaces where exorcistic formulas, condemned writings, or unedited visionary texts were safeguarded. The architectural emphasis on restriction indicates that certain books were regarded as potentially harmful if mishandled or read without guidance. The alcove therefore functioned as a controlled environment within which ambiguous or contested material could be preserved without circulating freely. A more mysterious example involves a hidden compartment discovered in the ruins of a monastic structure dissolved during a political conflict. The compartment contained no manuscripts, yet architectural evidence suggests it once housed scrolls or codices stacked horizontally. The compartment's placement, embedded within a load-bearing wall and accessible only through a removable panel, signals its use as a secure repository. Historians studying the ruins argue that the compartment may have been employed to protect materials during periods of unrest, or to hide works that authorities sought to confiscate. The absence of surviving texts invites speculation, but the method of concealment implies an intentional effort to safeguard knowledge that was considered valuable, sensitive, or vulnerable to destruction. This discovery highlights how physical structures often carried traces of intellectual struggles now otherwise lost. The final strand in this architectural network involves a vanished ecclesiastical vault, referenced in early inventories, but missing from later documentation. The vault's description suggests that it held materials distinct from the main archival collections, possibly including financial records, legal testimonies, or theological submissions. Its disappearance, whether through renovation, collapse, or deliberate reallocation, erased an entire dimension of archival organization. Historians analyzing the discrepancy between early and later inventories propose that the vault may have contained documents related to internal disputes or sensitive political alliances. If so, its disappearance reflects the fluid relationship between physical space and institutional memory. By removing or repurposing the vault, authorities could have altered the trajectory of historical evidence, allowing certain materials to fade while prioritizing others. The case illustrates how the built environment influences what survives and what enters historical consciousness. Together, these 5 strands reveal how ecclesiastical architecture played a crucial role in shaping the preservation, suppression, and transmission of knowledge. Hidden rooms, restricted alcoves, secret archives, concealed compartments, and vanished vaults demonstrate that the management of information extended beyond doctrinal judgments into the physical realm. Structures were manipulated to control access, to isolate controversial materials, and to create layers of secrecy that limited the visibility of sensitive documents. This interplay between architecture and authority shaped the historical record, influencing which materials remain available to modern scholars and which survive only as traces in inventories, marginal notes, or architectural anomalies. The implications of this architectural secrecy extend far beyond the individual spaces. By creating physical barriers to knowledge, ecclesiastical authorities developed a system in which sensitive materials could be preserved without being publicly acknowledged. This strategy safeguarded documents that were too valuable to destroy, yet too problematic to circulate. It also provided flexibility. Materials could be hidden temporarily during periods of turmoil or retained indefinitely in spaces inaccessible to most clergy. The physical concealment of knowledge thus functioned as an adaptive mechanism, responding to changing political, theological, and social pressures. For historians, the study of hidden rooms within ecclesiastical structures underscores the challenge of interpreting absence. The physical disappearance of a vault, the empty chamber, the sealed alcove, these features reveal decisions made long after the documents themselves have vanished. The architectural record becomes a witness to forms of control that left little textual evidence. Understanding these spaces requires attention to building plans, construction techniques, renovation records, and the subtle clues preserved in stone and timber. Such evidence complicates simplistic narratives about ecclesiastical transparency or secrecy, revealing a layered system in which structures served as instruments of governance. This movement from intellectual suppression to architectural concealment sets the stage for the next chapter, where attention shifts from spaces designed to hide knowledge to procedural mechanisms crafted to deny recognition, to witnesses whose accounts raised uncomfortable questions. If hidden rooms illustrate the physical dimension of suppression, the scrutiny of witnesses reveals the procedural dimension, moments when testimonies were quietly dismissed, restricted, or archived without acknowledgement, shaping the historical narrative as decisively as any sealed chamber. Historians studying ecclesiastical judicial processes frequently highlight that the Church's handling of witness testimony often determined not only the outcome of particular investigations, but also the shape of the historical record. Testimonies could illuminate anomalies, expose disputed practices, or introduce interpretations that complicated doctrinal or political narratives. Yet these same testimonies could also be judged ambiguous, unreliable, or dangerously suggestive. Within this framework, witnesses were not simply individuals providing information, they became vectors of risk, capable of introducing perspectives the Church preferred to contain or neutralize. The result is a documentary landscape in which some voices were amplified, while others faded into silence, creating gaps and contradictions that still challenge scholars seeking to reconstruct contested events. One notable strand in this dynamic involves testimonies dismissed on grounds of inconsistency. Ecclesiastical investigators expected clarity, coherence, and alignment with established categories of discernment. When witnesses described experiences that defied conventional interpretation, visions lacking recognizable symbolism, encounters reported in ambiguous language, or narratives shifting under questioning, authorities often classified the accounts as unreliable. However, historians examining these cases observed that inconsistency did not always arise from fabrication. Some witnesses attempted to articulate events for which they lacked conceptual vocabulary, while others struggled under the pressure of interrogation. In certain instances, multiple testimonies were dismissed collectively, despite sharing core details, suggesting that the inconsistencies may have been judged more dangerous than the details themselves. These suppressed testimonies reflect an institutional preference for interpretive stability over narratives that introduced confusion or complexity, even when the events described were not overtly heretical. The second strand concerns testimonies collected during the evaluation of alleged supernatural occurrences that were subsequently archived without conclusion. Investigators sometimes gathered detailed witness reports describing unexplained phenomena, lights, sounds, healings, or apparitions, only to halt the inquiry before issuing an official judgment. Surviving documentation shows that these reports were preserved, but marked with notes indicating suspension or deferral. Historians interpret these cases as moments when the authorities recognized the potential for widespread fascination or theological misinterpretation. By declining to issue a verdict, the Church avoided both endorsement and condemnation. The testimonies, though preserved, were effectively neutralized through procedural pause, relegated to archival spaces where they remained inaccessible to broader discussion. This pattern illustrates how the Church could manage potentially disruptive narratives by allowing them to exist without interpretive authority, ensuring that ambiguous accounts did not gain traction. Another notable pattern appears in witness statements discredited due to perceived influence from dreams or visionary states. Medieval and early modern spiritual culture placed significant emphasis on the discernment of visions, yet authorities distinguished sharply between legitimate encounters and experiences attributed to imagination, illness, or external suggestion. Testimonies grounded in dreams were particularly vulnerable to dismissal. Witnesses who described symbolic or nocturnal experiences often found their accounts labeled as products of fantasy rather than evidence. Yet some of these statements contained details corroborated by external sources, indicating a more complex interplay between personal experience and communal events. Scholars investigating these cases suggest that the categorization of such testimonies as dream-induced served as a procedural tool for limiting the authority of narratives that complicated doctrinal positions or introduced interpretations difficult to reconcile with ecclesiastical frameworks. The dismissal of visionary testimonies reflects a broader attempt to regulate the boundary between spiritual insight and imagination, ensuring that ambiguous experiences did not reshape theological understanding. The final strand of witness suppression emerges in the context of political investigations, where testimonies implicating powerful figures were quietly sidelined. Ecclesiastical courts navigated delicate relationships between religious and secular authorities, and testimonies that threatened these relationships required careful handling. Records indicate instances in which witnesses described actions or communications involving influential clerics or noble patrons, only for their statements to be categorized as unverifiable or motivated by personal grievance. In some cases, testimonies disappeared entirely from later summaries, preserved only in early drafts or marginal notes. Historians studying these discrepancies argue that procedural dismissal often reflected political sensitivity rather than evidentiary weakness. Suppressing such testimonies helped maintain institutional stability and prevented the escalation of disputes that could strain alliances or erode public trust. The selective rejection of politically risky statements demonstrates how procedural mechanisms could shape the contours of official memory. Taken together, these four strands portray a judicial system in which witness credibility was assessed not only through criteria of truthfulness, but through considerations of doctrinal coherence, social stability, and political prudence. The filtering of testimonies provided a means for ecclesiastical authorities to manage uncertainty. When accounts threatened to introduce narratives at odds with institutional priorities, procedural dismissal functioned as a tool for preserving interpretive control. This approach did not necessarily imply malign intent. Rather, it reflected an institutional logic aimed at maintaining unity, preventing confusion, and safeguarding the authority of established structures. The consequences of these decisions ripple across the historical record. Suppressed testimonies create gaps that complicate attempts to reconstruct events. Scholars often encounter contradictory reports, abrupt discontinuities, or references to missing statements that suggest a fuller narrative once existed. The challenge lies in interpreting silence as part of the story. Absence becomes evidence of processes that shaped the boundaries of acceptable discourse. The dismissal of certain voices also influenced how communities understood their own history, limiting the transmission of alternative perspectives and reinforcing official interpretations. As a result, modern reconstructions of contested events must navigate between the surviving documents and the shadows cast by those that were suppressed. These procedural silences also reveal the delicate balance between spiritual discernment and institutional governance. Witnesses who described complex or unsettling experiences were often sidelined, not because they were believed to be deceptive, but because their accounts introduced interpretive challenges the Church preferred to avoid. The regulation of testimony thus functioned as an extension of doctrinal oversight, shaping not only what could be believed, but what could be said. This environment of procedural suppression forms the threshold to the next chapter, where attention shifts from witnesses whose voices were muted to ecclesiastical figures whose involvement in prohibited activities prompted disciplinary action. If Section 18 reveals how testimonies could be restrained, the next chapter shows how certain individuals, clerics, scholars, or monks, became themselves the subjects of suppression when their actions or ideas crossed boundaries the Church considered perilous. Historians examining disciplinary records within ecclesiastical institutions frequently observe that behind the formal mechanisms of correction lay a quieter history involving figures whose intellectual pursuits, ritual experiments, or interpretive boldness conflicted with boundaries the Church sought to protect. These individuals, monks, clerics, scholars, and occasionally itinerant preachers, rarely articulated overt heresies. Instead, they crossed lines the Church considered precarious, engaging with materials or practices that risked blurring distinctions essential to theological coherence. Their stories, preserved in fragments, reveal a dimension of suppression not directed at movements or ideas alone, but at the individuals whose curiosity or experimentation placed them in liminal positions within ecclesiastical life. One striking example appears in records describing a monk disciplined for circulating esoteric translations. The surviving notes indicate that he had acquired texts blending Christian allegory with philosophical motifs drawn from late antique traditions. His translations were not condemned for explicit error, but for the interpretive liberty they displayed. Authorities feared that his renderings introduced metaphors capable of altering doctrinal emphasis. The disciplinary action did not take the form of formal censure. Instead, the monk was quietly reassigned, his manuscripts confiscated, and his work removed from the scriptorium. Historians highlight that the Church's response reflected both respect for his intellectual ability and anxiety about conceptual drift. By limiting his influence rather than prosecuting him, ecclesiastical leaders reinforced doctrinal boundaries while avoiding unnecessary scandal. The episode illustrates how intellectual curiosity, even when motivated by devotional intent, could provoke intervention when it ventured too far beyond recognized frameworks. Another case involves a cleric reprimanded for assembling a private collection of ritual formulas. The formulas, drawn from diverse sources, included passages used in blessings, protections, and supplications. While many of these texts were considered harmless in isolation, the combination suggested an attempt to craft a personalized repertoire of ritual practice. Ecclesiastical authorities viewed this synthesis with suspicion, concerned that it might approximate forms of magical thinking or encourage unauthorized liturgical experimentation. The cleric's intentions remain unclear. Some scholars propose that he sought to preserve regional practices threatened by liturgical reform, while others argue that he pursued a personal interest in ritual symbolism. The reprimand he received, formal enough to be recorded, but not severe enough to end his career, demonstrates how the Church distinguished between error and potential danger. By dismantling his collection, authorities sought to prevent the emergence of hybrid rituals that could alter communal understanding of sacred action. A third disciplinary episode concerns a scholar whose commentary on angelology advanced speculative interpretations of celestial hierarchy. Drawing on both scriptural exegesis and philosophical reasoning, he proposed subtle shifts in the classification of angelic beings. While his ideas did not deny doctrine, they introduced theoretical distinctions that risked confusing established teaching. Ecclesiastical reviewers judged his approach overly imaginative, blurring the line between theological reflection and metaphysical invention. His work was not condemned but placed under restriction, and he was instructed to revise sections deemed excessively speculative. The response demonstrated the Church's careful monitoring of categories it considered foundational to Christian cosmology. Angelology, though distant from core sacramental practice, played a role in shaping the spiritual imagination of believers. Unregulated speculation risked generating cosmologies incompatible with doctrinal clarity. The moderation imposed on the scholar's work reflects an effort to safeguard conceptual order while preserving the value of legitimate inquiry. A more opaque case involves a lay brother disciplined for reciting apocryphal stories during communal gatherings. These narratives, rooted in regional folklore, blended biblical motifs with legendary embellishments. The stories themselves were not unusual within popular devotion, yet ecclesiastical authorities expressed concern that some elements contradicted doctrinal teaching or introduced theological implications lacking foundation. The lay brother's recitation attracted attention because it occurred within a monastic setting where doctrinal accuracy was expected. His discipline took the form of corrective instruction and temporary withdrawal from communal duties. Historians interpret the episode as an effort to regulate the boundary between popular devotion and monastic teaching. The Church recognized the value of storytelling as a pedagogical tool, but sought to prevent the transmission of narratives that might distort the theological framework. The corrective measures reflect an attempt to balance pastoral understanding with the need for doctrinal integrity. A final disciplinary incident concerns a priest whose private notebooks contained speculative reflections on prelapsarian humanity. His writings, influenced by philosophical anthropology, proposed interpretations of human nature prior to the fall that diverged from established teaching. The notebook suggested possibilities regarding consciousness, embodiment, and moral agency that raised theological questions the Church considered premature or ambiguous. When his writings came to the attention of ecclesiastical authorities, he was instructed to cease further speculation and surrender the notebooks. Rather than levying formal punishment, the Church opted for a confidential intervention aimed at preventing the spread of ideas that could complicate catechetical instruction or unsettle doctrinal coherence. The priest remained in ministry, yet his intellectual pursuits were curtailed. This quiet containment underscores how speculative anthropology, though pursued sincerely, could be viewed as destabilizing when it probed questions foundational to the understanding of salvation history. Taken together, these 5 disciplinary episodes reveal the Church's nuanced engagement with individuals operating at the threshold of theological and ritual exploration. The actions taken did not seek to suppress creativity or intellectual vigor. Rather, they aimed to prevent ideas and practices from developing in ways that could disrupt communal belief. The suppression of individuals thus functioned as a preventative measure, shaping the conditions in which inquiry could occur. The Church's approach was neither uniformly harsh nor uniformly permissive, but calibrated to the perceived dangers of each situation. These subtle interventions ensured that deviations remained contained, preventing the emergence of broader controversies. The historical consequences of these disciplinary actions extend beyond the individuals involved. The confiscation of manuscripts, the redirection of careers, and the quiet correction of doctrinal irregularities influenced the preservation of texts and the development of theological reflection. Some ideas were lost because their authors were discouraged, others survived only in revised form. The historical record reflects these dynamics: gaps in manuscript traditions, abrupt shifts in scholarly tone, and inconsistencies in doctrinal trajectories often point to moments when suppression shaped the evolution of Christian thought. These disciplinary episodes also illuminate the broader pattern of how authority was exercised within ecclesiastical structures. Individuals who ventured into speculative territory often did so with sincere devotion, yet their work encountered limits established to protect communal coherence. The Church's responses demonstrate a complex interplay between intellectual openness and doctrinal vigilance. By regulating individuals rather than declaring wholesale condemnations, ecclesiastical authorities maintained flexibility while preserving order. This movement from suppressed individuals to the larger domain of hidden correspondence marks the transition to the next chapter. If Section 19 reveals how personal actions and private writings could prompt intervention, Section 20 will trace the fate of letters, reports, and communications that disappeared from the record, documents whose absence suggests that certain exchanges were considered too volatile, too revealing, or too disruptive to preserve openly. Historians examining the documentary practices of the medieval and early modern Church frequently observed that the most revealing insights often come not from preserved records, but from the unexplained gaps surrounding them. Letters, reports, and internal communications once moved constantly across ecclesiastical networks, shaping decisions and informing doctrinal judgments. Yet many of these documents vanished before reaching modern archives, leaving behind traces in the form of citations, summaries, or abrupt references to correspondence that no longer exists. The reasons for these disappearances vary: administrative error, political pressure, or deliberate removal, but the cumulative effect is unmistakable. Entire strands of communication remain only as shadows, hinting at conversations and crises that shaped ecclesiastical life from behind a veil of selective preservation. One illustrative strand appears in episcopal reports that were circulated during doctrinal disputes, but later removed from formal collections. Surviving references in conciliar acts and theological commentaries indicate that certain bishops submitted detailed analyses addressing contested interpretations of Scripture or moral theology. These reports, however, do not appear in the archives where they should be found. Scholars studying the gaps suggest that the documents may have introduced arguments that complicated emerging consensus or articulated concerns that later authorities preferred not to emphasize. In some cases, the disappearance corresponds to moments when the Church sought to project unity in the face of external pressures. The missing reports, therefore, reveal not only the arguments they once contained, but the institutional desire to curtail debate that threatened to prolong uncertainty. Their absence marks points where the historical record reflects the needs of stability rather than the full breadth of theological engagement. A second strand emerges in the context of letters sent by regional clergy describing local cults or popular practices. These letters, mentioned in visitation records and administrative summaries, often contained observations about devotional trends developing outside formal ecclesiastical oversight. Some described unapproved rituals, while others outlined the rapid spread of charismatic figures whose influence unsettled parishes. References to these letters reveal that they played a role in prompting investigations or reforms, yet the letters themselves are missing. Historians argue that their disappearance may reflect concerns about documenting practices the Church sought to regulate quietly. By removing or failing to preserve such correspondence, ecclesiastical authorities reduced the risk that future readers would interpret these episodes as tacit endorsements or as evidence of disorder. The vanished letters indicate an institutional inclination to contain sensitive information that could complicate the presentation of pastoral stability or doctrinal continuity. Another pattern of disappearance concerns drafts of theological consultations, prepared for internal debate. These drafts were circulated among small circles of scholars and clerics, tasked with evaluating new interpretations or responding to emerging questions. Some drafts received brief mention in final reports, suggesting that they contained preliminary analyses or speculative positions that did not align with the eventual judgment. Their absence from later archives suggests that they were intentionally excluded from preservation, either to avoid confusion or to prevent the elevation of tentative ideas to the status of authoritative teaching. The omission of drafts represents a conscious separation between the process of discernment and the final outcome, reinforcing the impression that doctrinal clarity emerged smoothly rather than through the negotiation of competing viewpoints. For modern historians, these lost drafts underscore how the development of doctrine involved intellectual exploration rarely visible in surviving documentation. A final strand involves correspondences between members of religious orders and ecclesiastical officials during periods of internal tension. Monastic chronicles and administrative logs briefly mention letters sent from abbots or priors seeking clarification on disputed practices, disciplinary measures, or interpretations of rule. Some of these communications, referenced indirectly, appear to have expressed criticism or concern about the direction of reform movements. Their absence from central archives suggests that preserving them might have revealed fractures within monastic communities or disagreements with higher authorities. The selectivity of preservation indicates an effort to maintain the appearance of cohesion, ensuring that internal disputes did not become part of the long-term historical memory. By eliminating correspondence that highlighted discord, ecclesiastical authorities could present monastic life as more harmonious and stable than it was in reality. Together, these four strands reveal a landscape in which official memory was shaped as much by omission as by preservation. The Church's archives, though extensive, reflect deliberate choices about which documents should endure and which should not. The disappearance of certain reports, letters, drafts, and correspondences suggests a recognition that written communication carried long-term implications. Documents that might confuse future interpretation, expose internal tensions, or complicate theological narratives were more vulnerable to removal. This pattern does not necessarily indicate a coordinated program of suppression. Rather, it reflects the complex dynamics of institutional self-presentation, where maintaining unity and clarity sometimes required curating the historical record. The implications for historians are profound. The absence of key documents creates interpretive challenges, requiring reliance on indirect evidence and cautious reconstruction. When references to missing letters or reports appear in surviving texts, they offer glimpses into debates and concerns that shaped ecclesiastical policy. Yet these glimpses must be interpreted carefully, recognizing that the voids may conceal both intellectual richness and political caution. The historian's task involves piecing together narratives from partial traces, acknowledging that the record has been filtered by generations of archivists, officials, and circumstances. The selective survival of correspondence also illustrates how communication itself can become a form of power. When letters disappear, so do the voices they carried. Voices that may have offered alternative perspectives, critiques, or warnings. The shaping of the archive thus mirrors the shaping of doctrine and discipline. Both processes involve choices that determine what becomes part of collective memory and what fades into obscurity. This environment of vanished correspondence forms a bridge to the next chapter, where attention shifts from missing documents to artifacts claiming extraordinary origins. If Section 20 reveals how institutional communication could be quietly removed from history, the next chapter explores the fate of objects whose existence posed challenges by virtue of their alleged connection to phenomena the Church approached with caution, objects whose suppression or disappearance raises questions about how physical evidence was managed when it threatened established interpretations. Historians who investigate the fate of anomalous religious artifacts often note that the Church's response to unusual objects varied widely depending on context, provenance, and the interpretations they elicited. Certain items were venerated as relics, others incorporated into liturgical life, and still others removed from circulation when their origins or implications proved too difficult to reconcile with doctrinal frameworks. The history of suppressed or disputed objects forms a mosaic in which material culture intersects with theological caution. The surviving fragments of documentation reveal episodes in which artifacts prompted fascination, confusion, and sometimes quiet intervention by ecclesiastical authorities. These objects seldom disappeared through dramatic edicts. Rather, they faded from inventories or were relegated to restricted spaces when their presence raised questions the institution preferred not to amplify. One notable object occupying this uncertain territory was a piece attributed to a saint through an unusually elaborate lineage of transmission. The item's custodians insisted that its provenance stretched across regions and centuries, culminating in its arrival at a small ecclesiastical institution. Yet closer examination by clerical authorities raised doubts about the consistency of the narrative, particularly regarding a missing period in its documented history. The object itself bore inscriptions and markings that did not align easily with the claimed time frame. Ecclesiastical officials, wary of promoting an artifact whose authenticity could not be verified, decided to remove it from devotional display. Rather than issuing a public repudiation, the object was quietly transferred to a storage area where it no longer influenced popular devotion. The episode illustrates how material objects could generate theological complications when their histories proved resistant to verification, prompting measures aimed not at destruction but at silent containment. A second object prompting caution was a textile long associated with early Christian worship, discovered in a region where liturgical artifacts were often preserved under layers of local tradition. The textile carried motif interpreted by some as symbols of apostolic authority, leading to its brief public display. However, scholarly examination soon revealed that its iconography combined early Christian imagery with later stylistic influences. The blending of eras created ambiguity regarding its origin and purpose. Ecclesiastical authorities, concerned that the artifact's hybrid nature might inspire speculative interpretations or claims of apostolic continuity unsupported by evidence, removed it from circulation. The textile was preserved, but placed under restricted access, demonstrating a pattern in which artifacts with ambiguous origins were treated with caution to prevent misreadings that could reshape local devotional practices or fuel contested historical narratives. Another case involved a small object discovered during renovations of an ecclesiastical site, accompanied by inscriptions that some interpreted as esoteric. The inscriptions combined biblical phrases with symbols associated in later centuries with mystical traditions. Although initial excitement surrounded the find, ecclesiastical examiners expressed concern that the object's combination of elements could encourage interpretations detached from accepted theology. The artifact's origin remained obscure, and no definitive explanation was offered regarding the purpose of its inscriptions. Faced with an object that could generate imaginative or speculative interpretations, authorities opted to remove it from view. The decision reflected not a fear of the object itself, but a recognition that material ambiguity could foster narratives difficult to regulate. The object's subsequent absence from inventories indicates that it became part of the category of items preserved discreetly to avoid complicating theological boundaries. A fourth object with a similarly contested history was a carved item whose iconography blended scriptural imagery with stylistic elements foreign to the region in which it was found. Its presence raised questions about intercultural exchanges that were otherwise undocumented. The carving's details suggested influences from artistic traditions outside the established ecclesiastical lineage of the area. scholars proposed several theories, including the possibility of contact with communities not represented in surviving records. Ecclesiastical officials, however, viewed the carving as problematic, concerned that its unusual features might inspire narratives presenting alternate histories or implying connections unsupported by doctrinal or historical evidence. The decision to withdraw the artifact from display stemmed from the desire to maintain coherence in the presentation of local religious heritage. The carving was neither destroyed nor publicly discredited. It simply vanished from inventories, suggesting a discreet removal intended to prevent speculation. The final artifact in this series of ambiguous objects involved an item whose origin was disputed due to conflicting testimonies. Some accounts described it as a relic, while others considered it a devotional object crafted centuries later. The divergence created a situation in which no consensus could be reached about its significance. Ecclesiastical examiners noted that promoting it as a relic risked lending authority to uncertain claims, while dismissing it outright might provoke controversy among those who revered it. The decision was therefore to relocate the artifact to a setting where it would no longer be the focus of public devotion. This approach allowed authorities to avoid doctrinal confusion, while preserving the object for future study. Its ambiguous status rendered it vulnerable to suppression, not because it posed a direct theological threat, but because uncertainty itself could generate interpretive challenges. Taken together, these episodes reveal a pattern in which artifacts occupying ambiguous conceptual territory were managed through quiet measures rather than public declarations. Each object introduced complexities that intersected with questions of authenticity, historical continuity, and theological interpretation. The Church's responses demonstrate an institutional strategy aimed at preventing confusion or speculative elaboration, particularly in contexts where material culture could exert significant influence on devotional life. Suppression in this domain did not involve condemnation, but careful distancing, removing objects from environments where they might generate narratives difficult to reconcile with established frameworks. The broader implications of these episodes extend into the study of Christian material culture. The survival of religious artifacts depends not only on their durability, but on decisions regarding their display, storage, and interpretation. Objects deemed unsuitable for public devotion were sometimes preserved under restricted conditions, while others disappeared from records due to reclassification or repurposing. This selective preservation shapes the landscape of what is known about Christian history, leaving certain material expressions visible while others recede into obscurity. For historians, the study of these objects requires attention to both the material evidence and the administrative actions surrounding their management. Inventories, visitation records, and architectural clues offer glimpses into how artifacts were classified and where they were stored. The absence of discussion about certain objects can be as revealing as explicit descriptions. These silences indicate decisions made at moments when ambiguity proved more difficult to accommodate than clarity. This pattern of managing problematic artifacts leads directly to the final chapter, where the focus shifts from ambiguous objects to the Church's most profound and enigmatic category of suppressed material. Items and accounts whose disappearance has left historians with enduring questions about what was removed, why it was deemed dangerous, and what traces remain to suggest the contours of what is now lost. Historians who confront the final tier of suppressed materials often describe these remnants as the most elusive within the ecclesiastical record, items known only through references, testimonies or discrepancies that point toward objects or writings no longer traceable. These materials form a category distinct from censored books, restricted manuscripts, or removed artifacts. They represent the outer edge of historical visibility, where evidence indicates that something once existed, yet provides almost no indication of its nature. This domain of vanished fragments challenges the assumption that suppression always leaves tangible traces. Instead, the Church's administrative and archival history contains voids suggesting the disappearance of certain items so thoroughly that only indirect signs remain to mark their absence. One notable thread within this boundary concerns objects that appear in early inventories but disappear entirely from later catalogues. These records often detail collections of relics, manuscripts, or liturgical items during initial documentation phases, yet subsequent lists omit them without explanation. In many cases, the early inventories include brief descriptions, sometimes a title, occasionally a physical characteristic, but not enough information to determine the item's significance. The disappearance may reflect routine reorganization, damage, or decay, but some cases reveal inconsistencies that raise questions. When related materials survive, while a specific object vanishes entirely, scholars infer deliberate removal or relocation. The absence becomes particularly striking when the missing item belonged to a category normally preserved with great care. These vanished entries function as signals pointing toward decisions made in circumstances now obscured, suggesting that the items may have carried associations or implications that later custodians chose not to perpetuate. A second thread appears in the category of manuscripts, referenced by contemporaries yet absent from modern archives. Scholars encounter descriptions in correspondence, monastic chronicles, or scholastic commentaries, mentioning works that cannot be located today. These descriptions vary in specificity. Some provide only titles, while others outline content with enough detail to suggest the manuscript's theological or historical relevance. The loss of these texts complicates efforts to understand debates or developments that occurred during crucial periods. When the surviving references imply that the manuscripts addressed controversial themes or presented alternative interpretations of established ideas, their disappearance takes on additional resonance. The absence does not prove suppression, yet the pattern of missing works linked to sensitive topics suggests that some manuscripts may have been quietly removed to prevent their circulation or influence. Their traces persist only as ripples left in the writings of those who once engaged with them. Another dimension of vanished material arises from the disappearance of objects associated with rituals that fell out of official practice. Ecclesiastical documents sometimes describe items used in local or transitional liturgical contexts, implements, vessels, or symbolic objects intended for rites that did not endure. As liturgical norms changed, these objects were either repurposed, stored, or discarded. Yet certain cases reveal a curious pattern. The objects disappear, not only from practice, but from all documentation, leaving behind rituals whose physical components cannot be reconstructed. Historians studying these gaps note that some of the vanished objects appear to have embodied theological concepts, later judged ambiguous or problematic. When ritual forms were standardized, the associated objects may have been removed to avoid confusion or to prevent the perpetuation of practices no longer endorsed. Their disappearance therefore reflects the intersection between material culture and theological development, illustrating how tangible objects could vanish when their symbolic meanings became misaligned with evolving norms. A fourth and final thread involves references to relics, whose existence is acknowledged in early testimonies, but whose later absence remains unexplained. Relics held central importance in devotional life, and their preservation carried significant pastoral and theological weight. When records describe relics that later cannot be located, historians face a complex interpretive task. Some losses likely resulted from conflict, theft, or environmental damage. However, certain cases reveal unusual conditions. Relics mentioned with reverence in one century vanish without mention in subsequent inventories, while other items from the same collection survive intact. Scholars examining such anomalies propose several possibilities. The relics may have been reclassified due to doubts about authenticity, relocated to private devotion, or removed during reforms aimed at curbing perceived excesses. The absence becomes even more notable when early sources attribute miraculous significance to the lost items, suggesting that their disappearance may reflect changing attitudes toward devotional practices. The vanished relics thus occupy a liminal space between recorded piety and later silence, their fate shaped by factors now irretrievable. Collectively, these four threads reveal how disappearance itself becomes an active force within the historical record. The Church's extensive documentation creates an expectation of continuity, making gaps all the more striking. When inventories, chronicles, or administrative documents hint at materials that no longer exist, the absences shape interpretation as decisively as surviving items. Scholars must navigate these voids with caution, acknowledging that disappearance may result from mundane causes, while remaining alert to the possibility of deliberate removal. The distinction is rarely clear, and the ambiguity reflects the complex dynamics that govern the preservation of knowledge within ecclesiastical structures. The implications extend beyond the objects themselves. The disappearance of items impacts the reconstruction of theological debates, devotional practices, and historical narratives. Manuscripts that vanish remove voices and ideas from the record, altering how intellectual trajectories are perceived. Ritual objects that disappear obscure the evolution of liturgical practice, leaving scholars to infer transitions from fragmentary evidence. Relics that fade from documentation reshape local histories of devotion, erasing layers of memory that once anchored communal identity. In each case, disappearance becomes part of the story, revealing how historical understanding depends not only on what survives, but on what fails to do so. This pattern also underscores the limits of any archive, however vast. The Church's records, while extensive, reflect decisions, accidents, and contingencies that shaped their formation. Each gap represents a moment where material reality diverged from its textual trace. The effort to reconstruct vanished items requires interdisciplinary methods, architectural analysis, codicology, comparative study of inventories, and the examination of narrative sources that gesture toward what once existed. Through these methods, historians attempt to approximate the contours of objects and texts erased from direct view. The vanished materials also highlight the tension between stability and flexibility within ecclesiastical tradition. Objects and writings that risked complicating doctrinal clarity or devotional order could be removed without disrupting the broader continuity of practice. These silences, though rarely emphasized, form part of the institution's history. The disappearance of uncertain or problematic items functioned as a protective measure, reducing the likelihood that ambiguous material would influence future generations. In this sense, suppression operated as both a theological and administrative mechanism, shaping not only what the Church taught, but what it allowed to endure materially. As historians reflect on these traces, the cumulative effect of vanished materials reveals a landscape marked by presence and absence, visibility and erasure. The suppressed or lost objects of this final category cannot be reconstructed fully, yet their shadow shapes interpretation. They stand as reminders that the history of Christian thought and practice contains layers that resist complete recovery, shaped by choices made across centuries. This recognition prepares the way for the closing reflection, where the weight of 101 mysteries converges into a final consideration of how disappearance, suppression, and survival together form the architecture of what is known and what remains just beyond reach.